Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. We'll get started in just a minute after everybody is able to log on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lilly.
Okay. It looks like we're ready to go. So we will get started. For the record, my name is Alan Lilly. I'm the presiding hearing officer of the State Water Resources Control Board's Administrative Hearings Office. Today is December 12, 2022, and it's just after 9 a.m. And this is the hearing by my office in our proceeding on the court's reference to the State Water Resources Control Board in City of Marina versus RMC Lonestar. And I don't have the case number here. Oh, yes, I do have the case number. It's case number, Monterey County Superior Court, case number 20 CV 001387. It looks like the appearances are all, we have Miss Meisenheimer is back. Otherwise, I think the appearances are all the same as they were last week. And again, for the attorneys, are there any other, Miss Meisenheimer, why don't you go ahead and enter your appearance since you weren't here last week, and then I'll ask if there are any other attorneys who are new who need to enter their appearances.
Good morning, Mr. Lilly. Larissa Meisenheimer on behalf of the City of Marina.
All right, thank you. Otherwise, it looks like all the other attorneys are the same as they were last week. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started. I have received the City of Marina's hearing brief for the second round of hearings and read it, but I did say I would allow a brief opening statement of approximately 10 minutes. So Mr. Spalding or Ms. Eisenheimer, would one of you like to give that opening statement now?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Lilly.
Please go ahead.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I will first address the new 2022 North Marina groundwater model. MCWD and the City of Marina have offered testimony from 3 hydrogeologic experts, each with her or his own unique viewpoint. First, we have Ms. Vera Nelson, who has deep experience with a wide range of groundwater issues in both the 18400 and the Monterey subbasins, including assessing Fort Ord remediation issues, preparing and evaluating groundwater sustainability plans for both subbasins, and conducting many analyses of Callium slant well impacts. Secondly, we have Dr. Todd Kincaid, who is a very experienced hydrogeologic modeler who has evaluated multiple prior versions of the 2022 model. Finally, we have Dr. Mark Trudell, who will be testifying today, who is an accomplished quantitative hydrogeologist, who, among other things, is a member of the owner's agent team for the Los Angeles Department of Power and Water for the largest groundwater remediation project in the world. Each of these experts is concerned about key problem areas with the 2022 model. And these problems include, number one, Callium's addition of a split DSA zone, layers 2 and 4 of the model, despite the lack of evidence showing that these are separate aquifers. Secondly, we have the strange configuration of hydraulic conductivity values in the dune sand aquifer, which essentially create a dam in the upper and lower DSAs without any apparent geologic basis for this configuration. Thirdly, we have the apparent failure of the model to accurately simulate the drawdown or the OWP observed during the test slant well pilot test. Finally, there is incomplete documentation on many issues, including aerial recharge and general head boundaries. As a result, all three experts conclude that the model is poorly calibrated, that key modeling decisions are not explained or documented, and that the model likely overpredicts ocean water percentage and underpredicts drawdowns. And this became apparent with regard to the pilot test. The model apparently predicts ocean water percentage of 99% during the pilot test, but the actual results were an average of 90.5% OWP, as we have seen. The model also apparently predicts drawdowns that were about 50% lower than the actual measured drawdowns. In sum, according to these experts, the 2022 model has not been shown to be reliable for assessing key groundwater issues that are before this tribunal. Now, it is notable that CalAM's experts claim that the project will not adversely affect MCWD's production wells, yet they have failed to do the necessary model simulations to back up this assertion. Instead, CalAM accuses MCWD of failing to do the modeling for this. However, CalAM wants to be the new groundwater extractor in the basin. The case law in this situation clearly puts the burden on CalAM to demonstrate that its extractions will not injure other basin users and will not harm the basin as a whole. And CalAM has not sustained that burden. The latest expert testimony also highlights the importance of the AEM field survey results. This AEM field data demonstrates that there are large areas of fresher groundwater in both the dune sand and the 180-foot aquifers. This data also vividly illustrates that CalAM's simplistic layer cake aquitard and aquifer conceptual model is fundamentally flawed. There are gaps in the aquitards that are shown in the AEM analyses that allow vertical hydraulic communication among and between many of these aquifers. Finally, I would like to turn to the 500 acre-foot per year question posed by the court. Question 2D asks, quote, can it be said with reasonable certainty that the amount drawn by the CalAM wells will not exceed 500 acre-feet per year from any water source beneath the CEMEX property? The city believes that this question is very clear, but acknowledges that several other interpretations have been offered. I'm going to talk quickly about the three different approaches that could be taken to this question. We think that clearly the appropriate way to look at the question is to interpret it in the context of the extraction limitation in the annexation agreement. This limitation states, quote, Lonestar shall limit the withdrawal and use of groundwater from the basin to 500 acre-feet per year of groundwater. When the court's question refers to water source, we believe it is distinguishing between water extracted by the slant wells underneath the land versus water extracted underneath the ocean. Since the wells are about 83% under land and 17% under the ocean, under this interpretation, about 14,000 acre-feet of groundwater would be extracted each year. A second possible interpretation, which we think is less likely, but which all parties have addressed, is that the court is referring to the origination of the water being extracted, looking at groundwater chemistry, and in particular, ocean water percentage. We have many data points and analyses regarding OWP. I'm not going to go into all of them. I think a couple that are significant are number one, the slant well pilot test results, which showed an OWP of 90.5%, which translates into an annual extraction of 1,650 acre feet. Secondly, we have the Weiss results, and the Weiss firm was employed as an independent consultant by the Coastal Commission. And Weiss made some tweaks to the groundwater model that they received, and then did model runs showing an array of OWP and acre feet per year volume calculations, which ranged from about 2,700 to 4,100 acre feet per year. And as you will hear today, Dr. Trudell finds the Weiss calculations to be the most reliable. The third approach, which has been offered, is the one advocated by Mr. Loeffler, who would refer only to the groundwater that is currently below the CEMEX property and would exclude any water that migrates under the property thereafter. Now, Mr. Loeffler has testified that the current groundwater would be consumed within about 1 year. And his testimony is that once this is gone, less than 500 acre feet per year of fresh groundwater would come from any water source underneath the property. The city's position is that Mr. Loeffler's interpretation is unreasonable and should be rejected for 3 reasons. Number one, the form of the court's question refers to years into the future, not just the consumption of the original groundwater. Secondly, once the original groundwater is completely consumed, new groundwater will replace it. And this groundwater comes from both landward and seaward sources. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the annexation agreement extraction limitation applies broadly to, quote, groundwater from the basin, close quote, not to groundwater currently underneath the property.
So excuse me, Mr. Spalding.
Yes.
I don't remember all the details, but I think Mr. Loeffler gave those answers that you just described in response to a question I asked. So I'm not sure it's fair to say that's Mr. Loeffler's argument. It might be Mr. Loeffler's response to a question I raised, but nevertheless, it is one of the 3 issues. So I guess the other thing I'll say is the court didn't ask the State Water Board to decide this, it's pretty clearly a legal issue and regarding the interpretation of the annexation agreement and the 500 acre feet per year. So almost certainly my draft report will set out these different possible interpretations and our estimates of the numbers under each of the interpretations. And again, I'm not disputing what you said. You're correctly raising that there are 3 possible interpretations, but I just want the parties to know, I don't necessarily think the court was asking the State Water Board to decide those legal issues. I think the court was more asking the State Board for technical input. So that's my way that I anticipate proceeding on that. So I just wanted to let everybody know. And with that, please proceed. And I apologize for interrupting.
No, not a problem. And thank you. I think, though, that it's hard to find any other possible source of the 500 acre foot per year limitation other than from the annexation agreement. We can't.
I do agree with that. I don't think anybody has offered that to the contrary, but I think the court interpreting the 500 acre feet per year in the court's question and in the context of the annexation agreement, there are different possible interpretations. And all I'm saying is I don't think the court asked us for asked the State Water Board for a definitive answer on that. So that's why I anticipate we'll say, if the court interprets it this way, here are the numbers. If the court interprets it this way, here are the numbers, et cetera. So anyway, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Well, I'm actually at the end.
Okay,
We
good.
believe it can definitely be said with reasonable certainty that under either approaches 1 or 2, more than 500 acre-feet of groundwater or water with a beneficial use would be extracted by CalAm here. And thank you very much.
Okay, and I guess the other thing, probably obvious, but I'll state it anyway. At least CEMEX, and I'm not sure what CalAm's position is going to be, but CEMEX through Mr. Neudecker has very clearly stated that they don't think the annexation agreement has gone into effect. And again, that's a legal issue that the court did not ask the State Water Board to decide. So our report will note that, and it will probably say something like CEMEX and potentially CalAm contend that the annexation agreement has not gone into effect. MCWD and City of Marina contend it has. But I just wanted to let you know that's we have a lot of issues the court has asked us to address, but those specific legal issues the court has not asked us to address, and of course we will follow the court's directions. So anyway, thank you, Mr. Spalding. I think you were within the 10 minutes I allotted if it hadn't been for my interruption. So I appreciate your introduction on that. And now, before we get started with Dr. Trudell, CalAm did file a motion in limine related to Dr. Trudell's written proposed rebuttal testimony, and City of Marina filed a response. And I apologize for not getting to that sooner. The opposition came in, I think, last Monday. And of course, I was occupied with the hearings last week. But I did get a chance to look that over last night. And just a minute here, let me get my papers. I did conclude after reading the papers that there are parts of Dr. Trudell's testimony that go beyond the scope I authorized for rebuttal testimony. I mean, the reason we have this phasing of the proceedings that we've ended up with is that CalAm did not complete the modeling and provide the documentation for that until it submitted its rebuttal testimony, which I believe was in August of this year. So because of that, in response to requests from City of Marina and Marina Coast Water District, I allowed them to delay the presentation of their witnesses and also to file written rebuttal testimony, which they did. But my order very clearly said that the rebuttal testimony was limited to responding to the new modeling work described in Dr. Ye's memorandum, technical memorandum, which is exhibit CalAm 89, and the portions of Mr. Loeffler's testimony, and memorandum, which I think was specifically exhibit CalAm 79, that discussed or described or referred to Mr. or Dr. Ye's additional modeling work. And I think a lot of Mr. or Dr. Trudell's written rebuttal testimony does in fact go to that. There certainly were many cases where he talks about the modeling results and his assessment of those. But the following paragraphs, I think, do not address the additional modeling work by Dr. Ye and really get back to rebutting some of Mr. Loeffler's earlier comments. And again, I did have a limited purpose for rebuttal, and I think some parts of Dr. Trudell's written proposed rebuttal testimony go really quite far beyond that. So my ruling is as follows. The CalAm's motion in limine filed on November 28, 2022 to exclude portions of the written surrebuttal testimony of Dr. Trudell is granted as to the following paragraphs of Dr. Trudell's written proposed testimony, written proposed surrebuttal testimony, which is Exhibit Marina 39. The following paragraphs are excluded, and that's 48 through 57, 72 through 74, 77 through 79, 85 through 88, and 91 through 93. In all other respects, Cal-Am's motion in limine is denied. Now, I understand that obviously none of you had this ruling until just now. So to the extent that any of Dr. Trudell's slides, which are in Exhibit Marina 41, cover any of those paragraphs, I'm going to allow him to briefly proceed with his summaries of those slides. And frankly, a lot of the materials in those paragraphs, Dr. Trudell had included discussions of in his direct testimony or his rebuttal testimony, which of course is not subject to Cal-Am's motion in limine. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going back and forth as to whether particular slides are may cover those paragraphs. I haven't checked that, but if they do, I'm going to allow it just in the interest of convenience. So with that, I am ready to proceed to give the oath to Dr. Trudell, and then to have a summary of Dr. Trudell's testimony, which with questions by either Ms. Meisenheimer or Mr. Spalding. I see he has 43 slides. I think 45 minutes will be enough. I'll give a little leeway if it's going to be a little more than that. But again, Dr. Trudell, I don't know if you listened to the testimony last week, but please don't feel compelled to talk fast, because that ends up just making it hard for me to follow and hard for everyone else to follow.
Okay.
So don't talk fast, but maybe don't include discussion of every single element of every slide. I have read all your all three rounds of your written proposed testimony plus your slides. So I think that'll make this go forward more efficiently, and we can get there. So with that, Dr. Trudell, please raise your right hand. Have it get mine and yours on the screen. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you will be giving in this proceeding will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do affirm.
All right, thank you. And I just have to make one adjustment here to my computer, so just one moment. Excuse me. Okay, so Dr. Trudell, is Exhibit Marina 2 your written proposed direct testimony for this proceeding?
Yes, it is.
And I see the figures are referenced in that, which are Exhibit Marina 4. And then is Exhibit Marina 28 your written proposed rebuttal testimony for this proceeding?
Yes, it is.
And I see you have references in that to Exhibit Marina 29, which is the figures. And then is Exhibit Marina 39 your written proposed surrebuttal testimony for this proceeding?
Yes, it is.
And I see you have reference to one figure, which is Exhibit Marina 40 in that. And then is Exhibit Marina 41 your summary slides for this proceeding?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so with that, I consider that he has affirmed his written proposed testimony, and I'll start the clock. It's approximately 9:30. So Mr. Spalding or Ms. Meisenheimer, whichever one of you wants to start the questioning of Dr. Trudell, please do. And Dr. Trudell, and again, I don't know if you were watching last week, but my staff puts up the slides, and if you just say next slide, we'll click to the next slide, and that'll make that go pretty quickly.
Okay, very well. Yep, thank you.
Mr. Spalding or Ms. Meisenheimer, please proceed.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Lilly, I would also add Exhibit Marina 3, which is the statement of qualifications for
Okay.
Dr. Trudell.
I don't normally separately refer to that because I assume that is cross-referenced in his exhibit too, but just so there's no, yeah, it's paragraph 6 of exhibit Marina 2 references exhibit Marina 3. So I think by that reference, he has already authenticated exhibit Marina 3 as well. There's no question that, at least I don't think there's any question that exhibit Marina 3 is an accurate statement of his qualification. So thank you for that clarification.
All right, well, why don't we launch in? Good morning, Dr. Trudell.
Morning, Mr. Spalding.
All right, I would like to ask that Exhibit Marina 41 be brought up to the screen.
Okay, we will screen share exhibit Marina 41. And we have slide 1 up there. Please proceed.
Dr. Trudell, did you prepare Exhibit Marina 41?
Yes, I did.
All right, can you please summarize your testimony using this slide deck?
Yes, I will.
Please go ahead.
Okay, well, good morning, Mr. Lilly, panel members, board staff. Thank you for this opportunity to present my testimony in this case. If I could go to the next slide, please.
And sometimes, Dr. Trudell, I will just state the slide number just so it's clear on the record, but don't let my statements interrupt your train of presentation. So we now have slide 2 on the screen. Please proceed.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Lilly. I'll look at the bottom part of the slide first. My organization of this presentation is going to be my direct testimony, which is organized by the questions and issues raised by the court, and my rebuttal testimony to other experts whose testimony was also organized in response to those same issues and questions. And then my rebuttal testimony related to the 2022 version of the model is presented at the very end of my presentation. So that's the basic structure. Contents are shown on the slide here, basically identifying a bit of background and then mostly focusing on the issues raised by the court. But specifically, I'll be talking to issues number 1, the subsurface drawing points, number 2, the sources of water, number 3, hydrogeological connectivity between basins, and number 5, lowering of the groundwater table. Next slide, please. Oh, Mr. Lilly, if you have any questions or other comments, please interrupt. I'll try to pause at the end of each slide. So if you have specific questions, you can ask them then, if you would mind.
Yeah, well, if you've noticed, from last week's proceedings and the prior proceedings, I'm not hesitant to do that. So thank you, and I will if necessary.
Okay, I have a tendency to go kind of fast, and so I mean, I'd always pause long enough for you to get your question in, but please do interrupt. Project domain setting. This is just basic background information. The yellow dots on this slide are CalAm's production wells in the Monterey Sub-Basin, which is shown in the kind of a purple color. The red outline next to the ocean is the Cemex property. Black diamonds are CalAm's monitoring wells that are MW series wells from 1 to 9 in proximity to primarily the project. And then the kind of blue curvy lines are capture zones in the 180-foot, excuse me, aquifer zone as modeled by CalAm. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I didn't pause long enough for you.
No, go ahead.
Okay, next slide, please.
All right, we're now on slide 4.
Okay, so these are the issues that were raised by the court. This is issue number 1. There are several topics here. We're all familiar with these, so I don't think I'll spend much time on this slide. We'll just move on and I'll deal with each one in turn. Some of them I'll deal with in combination, others I will deal with individually. Next slide, please.
All right, we're on slide 5 now.
Yes. So this is issue 1A, where are the subsurface drawing points, including capture zones for each of the proposed CalAm wells in relation to seawater in the ocean itself. In that respect, the slant wells proposed by Cemex, and this is from the EIR of 2018, 82.6 of the slant wells will be screened beneath the land, 17.4% beneath the ocean. CalAm only looked at sea or landward directed horizontal gradients in the dune sand aquifer. DSA means dune sand aquifer, 180-foot aquifer. Even though the seaward gradient in the DSA is observed in monitoring well data since 2016. As you can see from these slides, which show capture zones in the dune sand aquifer and the 180-foot aquifer, representing different hydraulic gradients that were modeled by CalAm. The capture zones don't extend very far inland. They're opening upward, they're opening towards the west, and they terminate at the ocean's edge. Next slide, please.
Oh, so wait, while we're on that slide, Dr. Trudell and Mr. Spaulding, you can certainly keep track of my time asking questions here. Obviously, that doesn't relate to the total time I allotted, but the upper slide here, or the upper figure in this slide, has a kind of a blue squiggly line that starts right to the right of the box that says Oceanside and sort of squiggles to the right toward the box that says DSA capture zones. Can you tell me what that is?
I believe that's a representation of the Salinas River.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
It's mostly shown in very light blue, but for some reason on that particular portion, it's the darker blue.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to clarify is, I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about CalAm's testimony here while you're talking, but I am pretty sure, particularly, I know Mr. Loeffler had some, I'll call them cross-section figures that showed water flowing in the upper part of the dune sand aquifer above the Salinas Valley aquitard from east to west. In other words, from land toward the ocean. So I'm not sure and I haven't gone through the modeling results, but I think they also show a gradient, at least in the western part of the DSA, going toward the ocean. So I'm not sure that your third bullet point is correct vis-a-vis what CalAm observed for horizontal gradients in the DSA. Certainly for the 180-foot aquifer, I think it is correct. But I'll just note that that's not the way I recall CalAm's testimony.
Well, I'll be presenting in my rebuttal portion quotes from Mr. Loeffler that state exactly what is in that third bullet point.
And that will be very helpful. So thank you. And with that, why don't you go on to the next slide, which will be slide 6.
Okay, thank you. So this question asks subsurface drawing points for the CalAm wells in relation to source point drawing points for the MCWD production wells. And on this map, you can see here, it's a little bit hard to see, but yellow dots are MCWD wells completed in the 900-foot aquifer zone. The red dots are wells that are completed in the 180-400-foot aquifer zone. And then right in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a single dot that has a production well that's completed in the 400-foot aquifer zone. And superimposed on this, you can see around the CEMEX site, capture zones representing various horizontal hydraulic gradients in the 180-foot capture zone. So the absence of the Salinas Valley aquitard in the vicinity of the project indicates that the dune sand aquifer and the 180-foot aquifer are hydraulically connected, and I'll be talking about it more a bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're on slide 7 now. Go ahead.
So this particular question asked by the court relates to the subbasin interface zone, how the two subbasins, the 180-400-foot aquifer subbasin and the Monterey subbasin interact. And my testimony is that the two subbasins are hydraulically connected. There's no reason why they wouldn't be. There's no faults, there's no stratigraphic pinchouts or other hydraulic features that would limit the groundwater movement between the two subbasins. The project slant wells will draw water primarily from the 180-400-foot aquifer subbasin. And the MCWD production wells are constructed in the Marina subbasin, but there's nothing that limits either the flow of water or the transmission of pressure response between the two subbasins. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're on slide 8.
This question in issue number 1 relates to capture zones in the sub-basin interface zone, that's 180 and the 2 sub-basins. This is a rebuttal topic. And so the rebuttal topic in this particular case is the hydraulic connection between the 2 sub-basins. Mr. Loeffler testified in his direct testimony, there are no hydrologically connected aquifers at various elevations below ground surface, the implication created by the label subsurface interface zone. Of course, my rebuttal to that is, and it appears that in Mr. Loeffler's testimony, he's talking about vertical hydraulic connection, which is, interfered with by the presence of aquatards, but horizontally, again, there is no fault, there's no aquifer pinch-out or other hydrogeologic feature that would form a hydraulic barrier between the 2 subbasins. And although Mr. Loeffler claims that the MCWD wells are too far away from project pumping slant wells and that there's intruded water between the 2 sets of wells, these are not hydraulic barriers. They don't prevent the movement of either groundwater flow or pressure response. And the observed groundwater level response in deep zone monitoring wells in the 400-foot aquifer show that pumping in the MCWD wells in the Monterey sub-basin produces a unique water level response that's picked up by monitoring wells, CalAM's monitoring wells actually, in the 180, 400-foot aquifer sub-basin. And that, I believe, is clear evidence that those 2 basins are hydraulically connected. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're on to slide 9.
So there's a lot going on in this graph, so I'll break it down. A horizontal, this is a hydrograph primarily. Horizontal axis is calendar date. The vertical axis on the left is groundwater elevation from the monitoring wells. Those are the wiggly lines that are in kind of green and red. On the right axis is the pumping, monthly pumping totals for the MCWD production wells, and that's the dashed blue line. And you can see that there's a direct correspondence, an inverse correlation between pumping in the MCWD wells and a water level response in the monitoring wells. In other words, when MCWD pumping increases, groundwater levels decrease. It's pretty much exactly what you would expect. During the winter months, when MCWD pumping declines, groundwater levels recover and increase. Again, what you would pretty much expect to see there. And you can see this pattern repeats itself all through time. Just to orient you, the box there in the middle of this slide, which is called H, that's the end of the long-term pumping test. But you can see that this response occurs during the slant well pumping test and also after the slant well pumping test. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're on slide 10.
This slide just zooms in on a particular portion right at the end of the long-term pumping test that shows you how increased pumping in the MCWD wells produces decreases in groundwater levels in monitoring wells in the 180, 400-foot aquifer sub-basin. Next slide, please.
We're on slide 11.
This slide deals with issue number 1F, asked by the court, where are the subsurface drawing points, including capture zones for each of the proposed CalAM monitoring wells, or sorry, production wells, in relation to the Cemex property. This is the table that was developed by CalAM. It's in their 2018 FEIR, Final Environmental Impact Report. You can see 82% of the, more than 82% of the slant well screen is underneath land. 17.4% of the slant well screens are completed beneath the ocean. That means that there's potential for this offshore screen to draw seawater vertically downward, but for the onshore screens, they have to pull seawater horizontally from the ocean to beneath the land and then into the slant well screens. So there's a significant difference there because it goes from water that's under the ocean to water that's beneath the land, and we'll see then when we talk about groundwater definitions that's an important distinction. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're on slide 12 now. Go ahead.
Okay, so this we're now moving on to issue number 2. So until now, we've been discussing issue number 1, which are mainly, I would say, questions of fact. We start getting now into more questions of my thoughts and opinions on some of these topics. And the first one is, in terms of issue number 2, will any of the currently proposed CalAm wells water drawn by those wells come from any source other than seawater from directly beneath the ocean? And my testimony here is unequivocally yes. And the main reason for drawing that conclusion is that the ocean water percentage from the slant well system is in all cases less than 100%. If they were only drawing ocean water, the water percentage would be 100%. If you look, for example, at the 31-month average ocean water percentage from the long-term slant well pumping test, that average was 90.5%, substantially less than 100%. And so the question obviously is, well, what's the other 9.5%? What kind of water is that? Where does it come from? Weiss looked at these questions in some detail, and he found that depending on the horizontal gradient, the ocean water percentage could be substantially less than 100%. And by that, I mean 70-something%. And so it's clear that the groundwater that will be extracted by the project slant wells represents a mixing of 2 water sources, seawater and landward fresher groundwater. I refer to it sometimes as fresh brackish water, sometimes as fresh water, and sometimes as fresher groundwater, but it's all basically landward based groundwater that flows to the slant wells. Next slide, please.
Okay, we're on slide 13.
So this further explores the nature of the freshwater percentage that's intercepted by the slant well. Excuse me one second. You can see on this cross section, which is from the 2018 FEIR, that there's a significant area between MW7, that's the well at the right end of the double-headed arrow, and MW4, the well at the left side of the double-headed arrow, there in the middle of the cross section, where the Salinas Valley aquitard, also called the Fort Ord aquitard, is absent. So there's no aquitard between the dune sand aquifer and the 180-foot zone. And so the fresh water that flows from the dune sand aquifer can flow then back into the 180-foot aquifer and be picked up by the slant wells, which are screened in the dune sand aquifer and the 180-foot zone. Next slide, please.
All right, we're on slide 14.
So that configuration, the absence of the aquitard enhances the ability of fresh water to flow to the slant wells. These maps just simply show the distribution of the Salinas Valley aquitard as mapped by CalAm in the FEIR 2018. And you can see that it doesn't really extend to the east of the CEMEX site. And so the CEMEX site where the slant wells are located has a potential to draw water from both the dune sand aquifer and the 180-foot zone by virtue of the absence of the aquitard in that particular area. Next slide, please.
Okay, just a minute here. Can you go back, please, to that slide?
Sure.
Thank you. I was asking my staff. So I just got a little confused here. That I know I looked at this before. What are the purple contours showing?
Sorry, the contours are showing thickness of the aquitard.
Okay.
In feet.
Okay, and I was wondering that. So does the aquitard, it looks like right there by the mouth of the Salinas River, the aquitard gets really thick. Is that correct?
I believe it is. I wasn't involved in the mapping, but it makes sense that it would be, because that's where a lot of sediment is deposited, right at the mouth of the river. And that's a combination of, coarse grained and fine grained sediment. So that wouldn't surprise me, but it definitely, in this mapping, which was done by CalAm, I can't really speak too much to the actual mapping that was done, but it does show there is a significant thickening of the aquitard at the mouth of the Salinas River.
Yeah. Okay, that explanation does make sense. So thank you. Now let's go on to slide 15.
Okay. Again, continuing with issue number 2, this topic is freshwater capture from the inland sources is partially determined by the direction of the horizontal gradient. And in the dune sand aquifer from 2016 to 2021, there's a continuous seaward gradient. It's observed in newly installed monitoring wells in the MW series. Those are installed by CalAm. The 180-foot aquifer generally has a landward directed gradient currently, but may become neutral depending on future sigma responses. And I did want to point out here that in my initial direct testimony, I had calculated a gradient in the 180-foot aquifer and had got the magnitude of the gradient correct, but I had the sign of that gradient as it was an error. So I had a negative gradient when it should have been a positive gradient indicating landward flow. So I did point that out in my rebuttal testimony. I didn't pick it up right away earlier, but I did want to point out that one error in my direct testimony.
Yes, and I had noticed that both when I read your direct testimony and then when I saw it in your rebuttal. So thank you for that clarification.
Okay. But the issue here is that seaward directed gradients result in more freshwater capture by the slant wells than landward directed gradients. We'll look at a figure that shows those kinds of relationships in a minute. But the capture zone changes dramatically depending on the direction of the horizontal gradient in particular. And that's actually presented in the next slide. So let's go to the next slide, please, and we can look at that.
Okay, we're now on slide 16. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is a conceptual capture zone analysis that was presented by Jacobs and James 2017 in their figure 6. The top panel shows what a capture zone looks like for a landward directed gradient. You can see how it's limited in extent on the landward side of the slant well system, opens up to the west and captures, far more ocean water than landward groundwater, and that's why we see these ocean water percentages in the 90+% range. The middle panel shows a neutral gradient, so this is basically no horizontal gradient. It's zero. Value is 0. And flow is basically radially to the slant well system and would come about equally from landward sources and seaward sources. And then the bottom panel shows what the capture zone would look like if the hydraulic gradient is directed seaward. You can see that the capture zone is limited on the ocean side of the slant well system, but is very extensive and opens up to the east on the landward side of the system. So that's why hydraulic gradient is very important in this discussion.
Okay, so Dr. Trudell, this is a very helpful figure and I appreciate it. I can't tell whether this is conceptual or intended to actually show actual conditions. I mean, my first reaction was this is conceptual, but then it does list Monterey Bay and seems to have an overlay of that looks like the CEMEX site and Highway 1. So I guess my question is this referring to any specific aquifer, or is this our project site, but for a conceptual aquifer?
Yeah, it's for a conceptual aquifer. This is a conceptual representation. It's not meant to be quantitative. It's really descriptive. But it does show the relationship between hydraulic gradient and the actual shape of the capture zones. The extent of the capture zones would vary, obviously, depending on what aquifer zone you're in, what pumping rates you're simulating and stuff like that. But this is I think, good conceptual representation of what the capture zones would generally look like, depending on the direction of the hydraulic gradient. And we do see that in CalAm's representation of capture zones that only look at landward directed gradients. Look at their capture zones, all look like the top panel, more or less. So they're limited in extent on the east side and open up to the west towards the ocean.
Okay, thank you. That's that. I thought it was for a conceptual aquifers, but I just appreciate the clarification. So we can go on to slide 17 now.
Yes, thank you. So this is a hydrograph. It's a similar hydrograph that we've seen previously. It's in this case, again, the horizontal axis is calendar time. and the vertical axis is groundwater elevations. And this is for the three sets of monitoring wells, MW7, which is the eastern most monitoring well, MW4, which is kind of in the middle, but very close to the CEMEX site, and MW3, which is closer to the ocean. MW3 and 4 are really quite close together. MW7 is a fair distance to the east, but what we're seeing here is the top line on this graph is MW7S. So that's the dune sand aquifer monitoring well. You can see the groundwater elevation there is always above sea level, typically around 10 feet plus or minus above sea level. Whereas at MW4 and MW3S, MW4S and MW3S, both in the dune sand aquifer, are substantially lower in groundwater elevation. So that means the head difference between those two sets of monitoring wells, MW7 and MW3 and 4, represents a seaward directed gradient, and it's colored in blue there to represent the proportion of time that we had that seaward directed gradient. And you can see, even during the pumping test, or sometime near the end of the pumping test, that gradient became dominantly seaward, and has persisted through time, as far as I know, even right to the most recent groundwater monitoring report that I've looked at. So, I think that's an important observation. It's based on CalAM's own monitoring well data. It's not new data. This is data going back to 2015, but that gradient we've seen has been persistent since 2016, even during the pumping test, which ended in early 2018. So, there's definitely something going on there. There's a seaward directed gradient. It's consistent, and it's an important factor that we just saw in the nature of the capture zone for those slant wells, and also how much ocean water percentage they will collect versus fresh water percentage.
So on this one, Dr. Trudell, are the S monitoring wells, which aquifer are the S screened in?
The S series wells are screened in the dune sand aquifer. M wells are in the 180-foot aquifer, and the D wells are in the 400-foot aquifer.
Okay, that's what I thought. Is there any figure in the record that shows the depths of this screening? So, one could basically just confirm that, depths of screening versus, of course, we have the cross sections which show the depths of the aquifers.
Yeah, the cross sections are the best visual representation. I'm sure there must be a table that shows the well construction information. In fact, I think it's in the individual groundwater monitoring reports. I think their first table relates to monitoring well construction. But
okay, you're right. The cross sections show the screening intervals for the monitoring wells.
They do, yeah, and they also show the hydrostratigraphy, so you can see which intervals the wells are screened in. The S series wells in the dune sand aquifer, and the M series wells in the 180-foot.
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
Okay. Next slide, please.
So we're now on to slide 18.
So this is a rebuttal topic, and this is with respect to horizontal hydraulic gradients. Mr. Leffler's testimony in the top bullet there, and I'm quoting, groundwater level data for wells located in the coastal dune sand aquifer, i.e. MW1S, 3S, 4S, and 8S, indicate that an inland gradient has been maintained within the dune sand aquifer. So this gets back to your earlier question about what is Mr. Leffler's testimony about the direction of the hydraulic gradient and the dune sand aquifer, and that's what he says.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Go ahead.
But you can see on this slide, the horizontal red line, this is again another hydrograph. It's a hydrograph for only location well MW8. The horizontal red line is sea level. So groundwater elevation on the left axis again, and the calendar date on the horizontal axis. You can see that through the entire record for MW8S. MW8S is, I think, 1,500 feet north of the transect MW3, 4, and 7. So it's not, along the same line of groundwater flow as those wells, which basically are oriented in the direction of groundwater flow. This is considerably further to the north, cross gradient from that series of wells. But you can see that the groundwater elevation is always consistently above sea level, typically fluctuates around 5 feet above sea level. And so what's hard to understand is how you can get a seaward directed gradient when the sea level is at 0 feet MSL and would have to flow up gradient to the MW8 location in order to produce a landward directed gradient. So, I think basic hydrogeology and basic hydraulic principles tells you that seawater cannot flow up gradient. And if it's not flowing up gradient, that means that the landward groundwater in MW8S is in fact flowing seaward, which is consistent with other mapping that we've looked at and other hydrographs that we looked at.
Okay, let's move on to slide 19.
So this is continuing the rebuttal topic of horizontal hydraulic gradients. Again, this is Mr. Loeffler's testimony in the top bullet point there. It is my and the HWG's opinion that inland hydraulic gradients have existed historically and currently exist at the ocean shoreline in both the dune sand aquifer and the 180-foot aquifer. Those are his words. But of course, we've looked at the hydrographs. We've shown them today. And as documented in the FEIR 2018, CalNAM model results only assume landward directed gradients in the DSA and a 180-foot aquifer of 0.004, 0.007, and 0.011. Those are actually in the 180-foot aquifer. But CalAM's monitoring well locations have shown consistent seaward directed gradients in the dune sand aquifer from 2016 through 2021. And these wells have consistently shown elevations above sea level in that 5 to 10 foot range. And Mr. Loeffler does not explain how seawater at 0 feet MSL can flow up gradient into the dune sand aquifer to these well locations that are in 5 to 10 foot groundwater elevation above MSL, excuse me.
So Dr. Trudell, I certainly, if necessary, will ask Mr. Loeffler to respond, but this quote does say at the ocean shoreline. And I don't know if from your review of the context of this quote, do you know what he means by at the ocean shoreline? Basically, how far inland is he considering that?
I don't know exactly what he means by that. I assume it's probably the mean high tide line or something like that. But I think the point he's trying to make here is that from that ocean shoreline inland, the gradient is landward directed. But if that's the case, that the seawater would have to flow up gradient to move inland, assuming that the seawater has an average elevation of 0 feet MSL.
Yeah, okay, I do understand your point on that. So, okay, we can go on to slide 20.
Okay. So this is from my rebuttal report, but it's Marina Exhibit 40. It's my approximate mapping of groundwater elevations and groundwater flow directions in the dune sand aquifer, looking at the typical range of groundwater elevations in that series of monitoring wells from MW1 through MW9. And you can see that, if you contour the groundwater elevations, what you get and what you see are groundwater elevations that are above sea level inland. They decrease in elevation, but are still above sea level as you go closer to the coast. And the indicated groundwater flow direction there, shown by those blue arrows, is towards the ocean. So in other words, that's a seaward directed gradient. And that, I think, is an important distinction from Mr. Loeffler's interpretation.
Okay, thank you.
Next slide, please. Again, staying with issue number 2, in this topic, can one approximate with reasonable certainty the percentage in what quantities the water would be drawn from each source? Can this be expressed in percentages? From the Weiss report that I reviewed, he had run a large range of simulations looking at different recharge rates, different horizontal gradients, and so on, different thresholds to distinguish seawater from freshwater. And in one series of simulations, he had a threshold TDS of 3,000 milligrams per liter. that predicted an ocean water percentage of 72.4%, which means that there was 27.6% fresh water in those simulations. And 27.6% of fresh water produced at a pumping rate of 15.5 mgd gives you about 4.3 mgd or 4,100 acre-feet a year of fresh water that's produced by the slant well system. And that's for a neutral horizontal gradient of 0.000. And depending on the TDS benchmark concentration, there could be even more than 4,000 acre-feet a year of usable groundwater that would be extracted by project pumping. That usable groundwater is mixed with seawater, but it does represent water that was originally fresh water, became mixed with seawater, and therefore is still a valuable resource that deserves protection, in my opinion. If we look at the next slide, we can see
so where, and I don't know if you can answer this from this model of results, but where would, if this pumping scenario and these calculations were to occur, where would the usable groundwater be?
It's mixed with seawater and what they call the intruded zone. So at some point historically, it was fresh water. At some point historically, it became mixed with seawater. So it is a mixture of seawater and fresh water that gives you an ocean water percentage of less than 100%. So it is a mixture, and so it represents that mixture of fresh water from the landward side and seawater from the ocean side.
Okay, so I mean, I understand historically there was fresh water somewhere, but I'm just wondering if you can give any more elaboration on where the freshwater source would be that would go into this mixing.
Well, as I showed in the groundwater elevation map, groundwater is flowing, fresher groundwater is flowing from the landward side towards the ocean. Particularly in the dune sand aquifer. At some point, it starts to mix with more saline water in the 180-foot aquifer. It's also flowing towards the ocean, where at some point there's a mixing zone where it mixes with ocean water before it enters, or just after it enters the ocean, or crosses that ocean boundary. So that process is still happening, and we see it in the aerial electromagnetic survey results, that there's a large patch of what they describe as fresher groundwater in the dune sand aquifer immediately east of the CEMEX site. And that's water that I, in my opinion, would say is flowing towards the slant well system and is mixing in some proximity to the CEMEX site, probably in the area where the Salinas Valley aquitard pinches out and is absent. So I think that's an ongoing process, but it's also representing historical conditions.
Okay, I understand that, and you're very clear about the dune sand aquifer flow, but could that produce 4,000 acre-feet per year?
Theoretically, yes, it could. So again, it depends on the modeling runs that you're looking at. Also, the threshold is an important factor. As I mentioned here, the higher the threshold for delineating fresh groundwater or landward groundwater from seawater, the higher the threshold, the more acre-feet a year of that mixture is represented by fresh or landward groundwater, even though it might be as high as 10,000 milligrams per liter, the landward groundwater.
Okay, thank you. That clarification is important. So, okay, we can go on to slide 22 now.
Okay, so this slide is in this case a table 2B from the WISE 2020 report. I've highlighted the case that I just described in the previous slide. You see, if we look at the right column on this table, this is for a threshold of 3,000 milligrams per liter, one that's commonly described as direct use groundwater, or I tend to refer to it as usable groundwater. I don't think that's a legal or a regulatory term, but it helps me, I think, explain the distinction between groundwater that's greater than 3,000 or less than 3,000, but direct use, I think, is the correct term. But you can see, if you look at different recharge rates, this is, a summary of WISE's sensitivity analysis. you can see as he varies recharge rates, a higher recharge rate gives you a lower ocean water percentage because you're bringing more fresh water into the system. And then that water is subsequently picked up by the slant wells. So it can be as low as 60.2% in the case of 15 inches of recharge per year. 10 inches of recharge per year gives you 65% ocean water percentage. And if you reduce the recharge from the sort of baseline case that's highlighted in yellow, the ocean water percentage goes up slightly to 77%. But they're all substantially less than 100%. I think that's an important distinction because CalAmp's modeling results tend to focus on very high ocean water percentages. And we'll talk a little bit about maybe why that is later on in this presentation. Next slide. Again, continue. Sorry.
Go on to the next slide.
Yes, we have.
Okay, let's go to slide 23.
Yes. So continuing with issue 2, this particular topic, do the relative amounts drawn from each source vary depending on the amounts drawn by the slant wells? This is a relatively minor phenomenon here. Again, looking at Weiss's 2020 modeling results of sensitivity analysis, he found that reducing the pumping rate in half had a relatively small, caused a relatively small change in ocean water percentage. The ocean water percentage went up slightly with the lower pumping rate, but it was less than 2%. So it wasn't really a major factor, but there is some relationship there. Less pumping gives you a higher ocean water percentage in general, but the difference is quite small.
Okay,
Next one.
go on to, these numbers are slide numbers are a little small. So if I squint, that's why. This is slide 24.
Yes, again, then continuing on with issue number 2, can it be said with reasonable certainty that the amount drawn by the CalAmp wells will not exceed 500 acre-feet per year from any source beneath the CEMEX property? What we're seeing on the right-hand side of this slide is a graph that shows groundwater in acre-feet per year on the vertical axis versus ocean water percentage. And this, if you assume a background TDS of 440 milligrams per liter, that's a threshold value, and a ocean water TDS of 33,500 milligrams per liter. Basically, you can see this graph shows how the ocean water percentage will vary, or the acre feet per year of fresh water produced varies with ocean water percentage, as you would expect it would. But the major threshold here is that very bottom horizontal line that represents 500 acre feet a year of fresh water extracted by the slant wells. And the crossover point there is 97.2%. So any ocean water percentage less than 97.2% is going to produce more than 500 acre feet a year of fresh groundwater as a mixture between ocean water or rather seawater and landward groundwater collected by the slant well system. Weiss's calculations, we just saw some of those. All I did was convert his ocean water percentages into acre feet per year just by doing straight unit conversion at 15.5 MGD. You can see that he was predicting 3,500 to 4,100 acre feet a year of landward groundwater to be, that was his expectation to be extracted by CalAmp's project pumping.
Okay, let's go on to slide 25.
So now I will start to address some of the rebuttal topics related to issue number 2, the first one being capture zones. And Mr. Leffler testifies that, and this is quoted here, the capture zone area from which subsurface water flows toward and is captured by the slant wells screen openings is located about half beneath the seafloor and half beneath the beach and inland area adjacent to the ocean shoreline, although water captured is predominantly from the area of the capture zone that lies beneath the seafloor. We have seen already that the capture zones modeled by CalAmp in the 2018 EIR are entirely beneath the land and extend east and south of the CEMEX property, but he doesn't show in his direct testimony or in the FEIR capture zones extending into the ocean. Mr. Leffler also claims that these capture zones will not overlap with the capture zones of the MCWD production wells, but CalAm has never done that I'm aware of any analysis to characterize these capture zones or what the capture zones of the MCWD wells look like. They have a calibrated groundwater flow model that can be readily used to do that calculation, but I've never seen them present those kind of results. Maybe they've done the results and didn't present them. I don't know.
Okay, we'll go on to slide 26.
Still on issue number 2, again, another rebuttal topic, in this case, vertical hydraulic connectivity. Mr. Leffler testifies within the area of groundwater level influence from the proposed MPWSP slant wells, the data demonstrates the presence of 3 major aquatards creates separate and distinct aquifer zones. So the main aquatards, the Salinas Valley aquatard, also known as the Fort Ord Salinas Valley aquatard, and the 400-foot aquatard, are discontinuous with significant areas where they're absent. So his general statement that there's these continuous aquatards that separate the individual aquifer zones is not really supported by either the borehole data that they've collected from their own drilling or from the aerial electromagnetic survey results. Excuse me. And where absent, groundwater and shallow aquifers are in hydraulic communication with the deeper aquifer zones and allows vertical flow to occur between shallower and deeper aquifers. Next slide, please. Excuse me.
Okay, we're on slide 27.
So again, this is dealing with that same topic of vertical hydraulic connectivity. These are results from the aerial electromagnetic induction survey that was conducted. Gottschalk et al. This is the group from Stanford working with others. The top panel here on the right shows the hydrostratigraphic framework. Kind of the lower brownish color unit is the 400-foot aquifer. Above that, kind of a medium blue wavy zone is the 400-foot aquatard, and then the shallower aquifers and other aquatards are above that. And you can see the aerial electromagnetic survey results on the bottom panel. And in this survey, the blue colors represent fresh water, the red and orange colors represent saline water, and the greenish colors represent a mixture of saline and fresh groundwater. But the thresholds they're using are kind of like 0 to 1,000 in the shades of blue, getting into the lightest greens. Greater than 10,000 in the reds and oranges. And then the green is they call sources of drinking water, probably in the 1,000 to 3,000 milligram per liter range. So you can see in this slide that to the right of that panel, right side of that panel, you can see green resistivity values penetrating right down into and through the 400-foot aquifer. So that represents vertical hydraulic connection between the shallower zones with fresher water and the deeper zones through the 400-foot aquatard, with the implication being that the aquatard is either absent or is not a barrier to flow in that area.
So Dr. Trudell, what is the A figure here showing?
That's the hydrostratigraphic cross section. So that shows the various units, and so there's in the legend there, you can see that there's a perched A zone. There's the dune sand aquifer, which is shown in kind of the brighter yellow. The Salinas Valley aquatard in kind of a very dark purple. 180-foot aquifer is in the kind of the pink color.
I understand all that. My question is, what source is this from? I mean, this clearly is not the result of AEM data. So I'm wondering what reference source is this figure from?
This is from the Gottschalk et al. Report.
Okay, so I'd have to just check them to find out where they got it.
Yes, I believe the interpretation came from Curtis Hopkins, and then they superimposed that stratigraphic interpretation on their own aerial AEM survey results.
Okay, thanks. So we can go on now to slide 28.
Okay. So we just saw what the AEM data show in terms of vertical connection across aquitards. This is Mr. Loeffler's conceptual model of the hydrogeology that shows in the upper brown layer as a continuous 400-foot aquitard, separating the 180-foot zone and the 400-foot aquifer zone. Doesn't show any holes or discontinuities in that aquitard, and does not appear to be realistic based on the other sources of data.
Okay, let's go on to slide 29.
Again, still talking rebuttal topics on issue number 2. This is the 500-foot acre-foot a year issue. And Mr. Loeffler's testimony, the total volume of per year of seawater intrusion, brackish water extracted from beneath the CEMEX property will decrease over time to a long-term average of less than 500 acre-feet per year. In order to get there, that means that the slant wall system would have to produce water with an ocean water percentage of no less than 97.2%. We've never really seen that in any of the data from slant wall pumping. From the pumping test, the average 31-month average from that slant wall pumping test was 90.5%. The highest ocean water percentage from any month of those 31 months was 94.8%. They're all less than 97.2%. And even CalAm themselves have indicated in the FEIR that they would expect a long-term average to be about 95%. That was based on the 2016 modeling. And that alone corresponds to 870 acre-feet per year. So Weiss's predictions, we've already talked about those. He estimates 3,500 to 4,100 acre-feet per year, depending on hydraulic gradient. But all of those numbers are higher than 500 acre-feet per year. So, I'm not sure what the basis is for Mr. Loeffler's testimony that the long-term average will be less than 500 acre-feet per year. Go to the next slide, please.
Okay, let's go ahead to slide 30.
And this is just, further documentation of the slant wall pumping test results. You can see it's month by month for the months when it was pumping or not pumping. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the average over the 31 months is 90.5%. This is a table from CalAm. It's from their exhibit CalAm 29, and it's table 2. So this is their data. And if you look at the individual values, you'll see that the values are in all cases less than 95%. So again, all indicating greater than 500 acre-feet per year if extrapolated onto a yearly basis. So
okay, we'll go on to slide 31.
So now we're moving on to issue number 3 that was raised by the court, and this is with respect to hydrogeological connectivity between areas from which CalAm proposes to draw their water and areas where MCWD extracts their water. We've already talked about this in some length for issue number 1, items C, D, and E. And it's basically referring to the hydraulic communication between the Monterey subbasin and the 180-400-foot aquifer subbasin. We've looked at hydrographs that show response in monitoring wells in the 180-400-foot subbasin related to pumping in the MCWD wells in the Monterey subbasin. So I think we've already covered this topic.
Okay, we can move on then to slide 32.
So now we're moving on to issue number 5. The question posed by the court, is it likely that any of the proposed draw will lower the groundwater table or reduce storage space in any source other than seawater? And if so, can the extent be approximated? What we're looking at here is projected drawdown, simulated drawdown in various aquifer units predicted by CalAm in their 2018 FEIR, and the different colored contours here, they're contoured down to 1 foot. The black line is the 180-foot aquifer, the green line is the dune sand aquifer, and the yellow circle is the 400-foot aquifer. And then you can see closer to the slat well system, which is shown on the left side of the map there, additional contours in the 180-foot aquifer that are substantially higher than 1 foot of drawdown. Not only is this drawdown very extensive in terms of lateral extent and area of extent. You can see I've got the numbers there on the slides. I won't go through all of those. But it's a fundamental property of hydrogeology that a reduction in groundwater or hydraulic head correlates to a loss of storage, because the storage coefficient in the groundwater equation essentially says for each unit decline in head, there is a release of groundwater from storage, or a groundwater that's lost from storage. That's basically the definition of the storage coefficient. And you can see there's an extensive area there that approaches where the MCWD wells are. There's almost certainly some degree of overlap between these cones of depression and the cones of depression from the MCWD wells. But again, it's a topic that CalAm has not looked at. They have the model that could be used to estimate that, but they've never done that calculation to show how the two cones of depression would overlap. So in other words, the two sets of wells will be competing for the same water from storage, and this decline in head would represent a loss in storage available, water from storage available to the MCWD wells.
Do you know what gradient, which, and I guess the variation in gradients is in layer 4, but what gradient is assumed for this figure?
You know, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I'd have to check that. I believe it's probably the 0.011 gradient, but I'm not sure about that. They tended to favor that particular gradient in most of their analyses, but I can't be sure. I would have to check that. It's probably in the figure caption somewhere from the original figure.
Okay, the other question I have, and this, I don't know whether you can shed any light on this, but this has bothered me. The issue 5B written up at the top of the slide talks about storage space, where your last bullet, and I think some of the other witnesses as well, have talked about groundwater storage. In other words, amount of groundwater in storage. Do you think there's an important distinction here between storage space and amount of groundwater in storage?
I think it's a difference in terminology. Some people think of groundwater storage space as the pore space above the water table that's not filled with water. And that's okay for a unconfined aquifer situation, perhaps. You know, for example, the dune sand aquifer has storage space above it that's unfilled pore space. But when you get below the water table, the aquifer is fully saturated with water. But without getting in too technical about this, aquifers are elastic media, and so they expand and contract in response to changes in pressure. And so when you decrease the pressure, the aquifer contracts. And when you increase the pressure, the aquifer expands, almost like a sponge. And so most wells completed in confined aquifers draw the majority of their water from storage. And so some of that is transmitted water that's flowing through the aquifer, but the majority is generally from storage.
Okay, that is helpful. Thank you. So let's go on to the next slide, which will be slide 33.
Again, continuing with issue 5, and that's the question of loss of storage. And looking specifically at the 400-foot aquifer, we've seen this same graphic before. But this time we're looking specifically at the response in the D series wells, the two bottom lines in particular, which is MW7D and MW4D. MW4D is closer to the slant wells, and you would expect to see if there was any drawdown in the 400-foot aquifer, you expect to see higher response in the 4 series 4D well than you would in the MW7D well. And you can see that to the left of the line, that's H, which is the end of the pumping test. There's a separation between those two, and you see more drawdown in the 4D well than you see in the 7D well. And the two deviate because the one that's closer shows more drawdown, which is exactly what you'd expect. And then after the pumping test is over, if you look on the right side of this graphic, the groundwater elevation in those two wells plots almost exactly the same. So there's virtually no difference in head over most of the record of this series of water level measurements. But during the pumping test, MW4D shows more drawdown. It's closer to the slant wells, indicates hydraulic communication and hydraulic response due to slant well test pumping through the 400-foot aquitard, and into the 400-foot aquifer. So I think that's an important distinction there. We do see response in the 400-foot zone due to slant well pumping in the 180 and dune sand aquifer zones.
Okay, just let me write that down. Thank you. Okay, so we can go on to slide 34.
Okay, still in issue number 5. Now we're talking about rebuttal topics. The first one is drawdown and loss of storage. This is kind of the main point of issue number 5. Mr. Loeffler's testimony is that it is not likely that any of the proposed draw will lower the groundwater table or reduce groundwater storage in any source other than seawater. And it's a pretty unequivocal statement. We've just looked at CalAM's own modeling results that show significant areas and extent of drawdown in all 3 major aquifers, the dune sand aquifer, the 180-foot aquifer, and the 400-foot aquifer zone, which we also talked about in terms of looking at the response in the hydrograph. Any drawdown in all 3 aquifers will give a decrease in storage. Again, we talked about how that change in groundwater elevation relates to change in storage. And therefore, the drawdown that's expected and simulated by CalAM represents a loss of aquifer storage in all 3 aquifers. So I'm not at all clear what the basis is for Mr. Loeffler's testimony shown on this slide, but it seems like it's not supported by their own data.
Okay, we can move on to slide 35.
Okay, so that slide ends my direct testimony and rebuttal testimony. And now we're moving on to my sur-rebuttal testimony, which is focusing on the review of the 2022 North Marina groundwater model, which is documented in Exhibit CalAM 89. And this is just a summary of the issues that I've identified with that model. Splitting of the dune sand aquifer into 2 units, I think, will reduce flow of fresh water. The westward extension of the Fort Ord Salinas Valley aquitard forms a low hydraulic conductivity dam. We'll look at evidence of that. There's some odd distribution of hydraulic conductivity, very high beneath the ocean, very low on the landward side. And then we'll look at how well the calibration does in terms of matching seaward directed gradients in the dune sand aquifer. And then the last item is deficiencies in the documentation of the model in that CalAM 89 report. So that's a summary of the issues I've identified. Now we'll go through them one by one. Next slide, please.
Okay, let's go on to slide 36.
So this particular slide deals with the first criticism I have there, the splitting of the dune sand aquifer into 2 layers. The previous conceptual model that was presented in the 2018 FEIR defined this dune sand aquifer as dune sand above the SVA aquitard. In the 22 conceptual model, they've got this now split into an A or what they call perched aquifer zone and a dune sand below the Fort Ord SVA aquitard, which is now called the dune sand aquifer. And it's not really clear what the basis for that separation is. The net result is a reduced saturated thickness for groundwater to flow in the dune sand aquifer. But it's important to note that there is no field evidence of perch conditions within the dune sand aquifer. If you look at their own cross sections where they show the groundwater elevation with respect to each of the individual monitoring wells, you can see that the groundwater elevation as you go in each well nest of monitoring wells deeper, the groundwater elevation is always above the top of the well screen. For a zone to be perched, you have to have a groundwater elevation that's below the top of the well screen, which means there's a second water table in the deeper zone, which represents perch conditions above. We don't see that in any of their monitoring wells. And I've looked at every single cross section. I've also looked at individual monitoring well groundwater level measurements, and there's no evidence of a second water table beneath the Salinas Valley Aquitard in any of their monitoring well data that I've seen.
Okay, you've got to pause here for a minute here because I'm seeing a couple of different things going on here that I'm not exactly following.
Okay.
It may be that I don't understand what perched means. I thought I understood what perched means, but maybe I don't. Are you saying that you can't have perched conditions in the layer above the Salinas Valley Aquitard unless there is at least some, I'll say, unsaturated aquifer in the layer 4 below the Aquitard?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's kind of the classic school book or textbook definition of perched condition. Perched conditions arise when you have a separate water table beneath the perched zone. It's there because there's negative pressure within that zone, which produces a second water table. The water table represents 0 pressure head. And in order to have that, you have to have a negative pressure head above it.
Okay, so, but what I'm understanding is what I'm not understanding is whether we call it perched or something else. Is there a problem with their adding the layer 2 for the part of the aquifer that's above the Aquitard?
Well, the perched part of the system doesn't really flow groundwater. So, or sorry, the unsaturated portion, which would be the lower perched, lower water table, the perched zone. In the perched aquifer zone, or what they call A aquifer, if it's just a mound, which is probably a more reasonable way to represent it, that that mounded zone will flow, but it's only flowing through a relatively thin portion of the dune sand aquifer. So you've got this relatively high head, but that high head is only in the upper part of the aquifer, of the dune sand aquifer, the A portion, and is not really present in the deeper portion that they call the lower dune sand aquifer, or just the dune sand aquifer. So, you know, we're not seeing the same. I don't think we're seeing the same quantity of flow in that split dune sand aquifer as we would see if just it was one continuous dune sand aquifer unit.
Okay, well, I understand that, depending on what model assumption you make. But my question is, I mean, I thought that the Cal-Am's modeler said they added the layer 2 in response to criticisms that the prior model did not have that layer. And I guess my question is, do you have an opinion as to whether or not that layer 2 accurately models what you're calling the mounded groundwater conditions in above the Aquitard?
It's hard for me to comment on that because, you know, when they present their calibration results in the Cal-Am 89 report, they don't really show calibration results by model layer. So it's difficult to tell how good the calibration, they show the overall model calibration statistics, if you will, but by model layer, you don't really see that breakdown of how good the calibration statistics are on model layer by model layer basis. So I don't know if it was necessary to split the dune sand aquifer into 2 units to improve model calibration. I don't know. I honestly, I'm not familiar with how they might have done that.
Okay, well, that's probably something I need to follow up with them about then. Okay, yeah, all right, that's fine. I appreciate those clarifications. Anything else you want to say about this slide, or should we move on?
No, we can move on. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to slide 37.
Again, this is a rebuttal testimony regarding the comments on the 2022 model. The distribution of hydraulic conductivity, which I describe here as K, that means hydraulic conductivity, is unusual when you look at how it relates to the ocean, the portion of the aquifers beneath the ocean and the portion of the aquifers that are inland of the CEMEX site. So we can see beneath the ocean, hydraulic conductivities in layers 2 to 6 sediments are very high, 250 to over 300 feet per day. That's about what you probably would expect. But then the K values drop dramatically when that same aquifer unit or same deposits of material are present in adjacent zones beneath the land. And the distribution favors land bridge, so you have very high hydraulic conductivity, very easy for seawater to move inland towards the slant wells. But then there's a barrier to flow that inhibits the movement of fresh water from inland sources to reach the slant well system. So what that means is that you're going to get a lower contribution of fresh water from inland sources to project pumping. And so the ocean water percentage is going to be, or the freshwater percentage is going to be underestimated. The ocean water percentage is likely to be overestimated.
Okay, and Marina Coast Water District's witnesses also raised this point, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing CalAm's response when we get there. So you can move on to slide 38.
So this just breaks down this question of the westward extension of the Fort Ord Salinas Valley Aquitard. The extension of the Aquitard is not that controversial. In other words, extending it westward. But what happens in the way it's presented in the model is that, you expect an aquitard to have a low hydraulic conductivity. That's normal. But what CalAm has done with that model in CalAm 89 is that they've got aquitard values of hydraulic conductivity, not just in the aquitard, but in the upper dune sand aquifer and the lower dune sand aquifer. So in other words, there's almost no way that water can flow through the dune sand aquifer with the hydraulic conductivity distribution they've got. In the A aquifer layer, the K value they have assigned, I'll show you a slide of this in a second, 2 feet per day. In the aquitard, layer 3, it's 0.3 to 3 feet per day. So the dune sand aquifer is actually in that one zone is lower than the upper end of the K value in the aquitard. And then in the lower dune sand aquifer, which they just call dune sand aquifer, it's 0.3 to 2 feet per day as the hydraulic conductivity. It's actually lower than the hydraulic conductivity in the aquitard. Why is that? Why would they apply such low hydraulic conductivity values to the dune sand aquifer, which I think pretty much everybody agrees has got, call it hydraulic conductivity values typically in the range of 10 to 100 feet per day, sometimes a bit higher. But values less than 10 feet per day are uncommonly reported. I don't know that they've ever been reported. Now the field data seems to show that it's more in the range of 10 to 100. Certainly all the prior modeling has looked at K values in the range of 10 to 100. But when we look at the next slide, we see where they apply those low hydraulic conductivity values. I think it's pretty obvious that that distribution of hydraulic conductivity is going to impede groundwater flow from the inland sources towards the slant wells, and that's going to artificially raise the ocean water percentage in the slant well system. And if we can go on to the next slide, I think it'll be clear once you see the graphic that goes with this.
Yeah, we'll go to, and this is slide 39. Go ahead.
Yep. So this is from figure 33 of CalAm 89. So this is their hydraulic conductivity distribution. The values you see there, the white portion are the basic distribution of sediments in the model layer. What the values there are hydraulic conductivity in feet per day on a layer by layer basis. So layer 2 is the A aquifer zone. Layer 3 is the Fort Ord aquitard, Salinas Valley aquitard. Layer 4 is the lower dune sand aquifer. And what I've got highlighted there in those kind of long, narrow brown patches, that's the hydraulic conductivity zones that are, what I describe as unusually low. And so in panel number 2, the second from the right there at the top, that's the A aquifer zone. And you can see that zone that I've got highlighted in brown has got that very low hydraulic conductivity of about 2 feet per day. The next layer over to the right is the aquitard, which has got the range of 0.3 to 3 feet per day. And then the bottom left panel, which is the dune sand aquifer layer 4, has got hydraulic conductivity values in that brown patch that are, I think, 0.2 to 2 feet per day. They're actually lower than the hydraulic conductivity range in the aquitard. So basically what we're seeing is that there's a strip of aquitard material right from the top of the system, right through the entire dune sand aquifer, as represented by that brown patch there, which is oriented perpendicular to groundwater flow. Groundwater flow, of course, is from east to west. So how does groundwater get through the dune sand aquifer, through that? I call it a dam. I think Ms. Nelson also calls it a dam because she's noticed the same thing as you just mentioned. And so why is that configuration used? Why, if you look at the other hydraulic conductivities in layer 2 and layer 4, the other dune sand aquifer hydraulic conductivities, they're all right in the range where you would expect them to be, generally about 10 to 100 feet. But that one strip has got aquitard values for hydraulic conductivity. It just doesn't make any sense to me, and I can't understand what the justification is for using such low hydraulic conductivities in a dune sand aquifer unit.
Okay, so do you also, for layer 3 is the aquitard, so that's probably okay. But for layer 4, the cells in the kind of near the bottom of the figure to the right of that brown cell, I see 2 of them that are 0.3. Do you have any comment on that? If that in fact is part of the dune sand aquifer, do you think those 0.3s are also too low?
I think those 0.3s are too low. So, I'm picking this particular one because it appears on each one of those 3 panels. But there are other areas that I would probably take issue with as well. And you just pointed some out there because that's supposed to be the dune sand aquifer. That's not supposed to be the aquitard. 0.3 is an aquitard kind of hydraulic conductivity value. As I said, one would expect K values in the dune sand aquifer to be in that 10 to 100 range.
Okay. Well, as I say, I'll certainly be interested to hear Cal-Am's response because it's something that I'll just say has raised a red flag in my mind. There may be a response, an explanation, or they may have an explanation, but I have not heard it yet. So you can go on to slide 40.
Okay, thank you. We're nearly done. So.
That's fine. You're doing fine. And I've been interrupting some, so we are taking a little more time than anticipated, but that's fine. So please go ahead with slide 40.
Okay, so this is related to model calibration. So, the Calum 89 talks a lot about model calibration in the dune sand aquifer and so on. So this is their map of hydraulic head distribution. This is for layer 2, the A aquifer, but when you get to the west of that heavy blue line, which is the outline of the Fort Ord, the Salinas Valley aquitard they've extended, the 2 dune sand aquifers there's only this, it's the same. And that's where we have the MWS series wells, so MW3S, 4S, 7S, those kind of wells. We've seen the hydraulic heads in those wells are always above sea level. If we look at how this is contoured, and it's a little difficult to see at this scale, I don't know if we can make this bigger or go to display or presentation mode instead of what we seem to be in.
Yeah, we can probably we'll see. We'll see if we can make it full screen mode. That might help. It's a little bit bigger anyway. Go ahead.
Oh, that's better. Yes, thank you.
And I have the paper copy here that in case you're wondering why I'm looking at paper instead of screen, that's because I've printed these. So go ahead.
Okay, so what we see here, those contours there are basically the higher groundwater elevations are basically sitting above the aquitard. Once we get west of the aquitard, you can see so those numbers are all above sea level. They start off quite high above sea level, and they start to bunch up as you get towards the edge of the aquitard. And then you see that one contour there that I've got an arrow pointing to, which is a zero contour. And the way those contours work is that you start off at a high level, you come down, and then you come back up. So inside that oval zero contour are all groundwater elevations that are below sea level, as simulated by the model. Now, this is at the end of their calibration period in 2019. So this is the model results that are supposed to represent the calibration period, which we know that in 2019, all the groundwater elevations in the shallow monitoring wells are above sea level. And this model result shows relatively large area of groundwater elevations below sea level. In other words, less than 0 feet MSL. So, I think there's a lack of calibration in this area. Again, they don't really document the calibration on a layer by layer basis, but this groundwater elevation map does not seem to represent the field data, which is supposed to be used for calibration.
So is the slant well pumping test ended sometime in 2018. Could there still be an artifact or a result of that pump test to have that part of the dune sand aquifer be below sea level a year later, or is that too far?
Well, we don't see that in the monitoring well data. I mean, we've looked at several hydrographs.
Oh, okay.
And we just don't see it. I mean, it takes a few months to recover, which is what you would expect. But I mean, this is, more than a year after the pumping test is finished. You wouldn't expect to see any residual drawdown, especially in the dune sand aquifer.
Can you tell me why the very left part of this rectangle for the model area, there's a contour with a 10 out in the ocean? Can you tell me what's going on with that?
I cannot. I noticed that too. It seems very odd to me. In the model, sea level is represented as, or the ocean water layer 1 is represented as 3 feet above sea level. This is layer 2, and there may be layer 2 sediments that extend out beneath the ocean. I believe there are, but how they would get to be 10 feet beneath the ocean, 10 feet above sea level beneath the ocean, when you've got values that are below sea level on the landward side. I mean, I don't understand why that is. I guess that would be a question for CalAm to address, because it doesn't make sense to me either.
Okay. All right. So we can go on to slide 41.
Again, this is just getting back to that same issue of the contours below sea level. We've seen this map before. This is my contouring of approximate groundwater elevations. You can see they're all appreciably above sea level. There's no values recorded anywhere in these locations in the dune sand aquifer, that is, that are below sea level. And so I can't explain why that contour in the previous slide shows groundwater elevations below sea level in this part of the system.
And what is the solid blue line in this figure? It's not labeled.
Oh, sorry. Yes, the solid blue line there, that's the area of the dune sand aquifer that is reported from the aerial electromagnetic survey to have low salinity water in it. So, this is an area, if you would call perhaps a recharge area, low salinity water in the dune sand aquifer that's flowing west towards the CEMEX site. So it just kind of relates the groundwater quality to the groundwater flow direction here.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we can go on to slide 42.
So this is another kind of odd artifact that I picked up in my review of CalAm 89. Their analysis, their analysis shows that the system stabilizes after about 10 years of pumping. That's probably about what most people would expect. But they're averaging their results in terms of ocean water percentage over a 100-year period. So basically what they're doing is taking 10 years of lower, probably lower than average ocean water percentage, and averaging that out with 90 years of higher than average ocean water percentage to get an ocean water percentage at the end of the 100-year averaging period, that's, I think, abnormally high, because it represents so many years of high ocean water percentage averaged in. I don't know why they would use 100 years. We don't expect the slant wells to last 100 years, probably 20 to 25 years. I think I've seen reference to the treatment plant life expectancy of around 50 years. So, you could probably justify maybe averaging out to 50 years perhaps, but 100 years, that just seems like it's a construct designed to increase the overall average ocean water percentage to perhaps make their project look more favorable.
Well, I'll certainly be interested in hearing Cal-Am's response. I suspect one thing they might say is that even if the slant wells have that much lifetime, you would expect them to be replaced so that the treatment plant could, or the desalination plant could keep operating. But we'll get their response.
Okay, all right.
So let's go on to slide 43.
This is the last slide, and this basically is just a summary of the I guess, deficiencies in documentation that I've identified. They've implemented aerial recharge in this version of the model, the 22 version of the model. It's from the regional Salinas Valley regional model. That's the Tim Durbin model that we're all familiar with. But for some reason, they didn't implement that aerial recharge using the recharge package in ModFlow. And instead, they've used injection wells with, I think there's 275 injection wells or something on that order, scattered across the model in the upper layer of the model. But there's no documentation as how they got those injection rates, how they correlate to the aerial recharge rates that came from the regional model. There's just no documentation. There's no discussion at all. In fact, you have to actually look at the physical model files to see that that's how they've implemented it. And I think that's something that could be better explained and supported with more information than is presently in Cal-Am 89. And then there's the question of the general head boundaries. So the way a general head boundary works is that you have a constant head boundary along the actual boundary of the model domain. So that's the boundary head that's imported from the regional model. But then the way a general head boundary works is that in addition to that constant head value, there's an external head value that establishes what the gradient is between the boundary and the part of the model domain that's outside of the boundary. And they have no explanation as to how they implemented those external heads. If the external heads are higher than the boundary head, you'll create flow into the model. If the external heads are lower than the boundary head, you'll have flow out of the model. But without knowing what they've actually done to implement the general head boundary, I have no way of knowing if those general head boundaries were implemented correctly, or even if they make sense. So there's just no documentation. So it's something that I think
they've provided the modeling files. Can you get this information from the modeling files?
They've been provided, and MCWD has got those modeling files. I have not looked at the modeling files. I haven't accessed them.
Okay.
So that might be available in the model files, but again, I haven't examined those files.
Okay. And I'm sorry, did I interrupt you on your last bullet point?
No, just the last bullet point is pretty straightforward. Again, raised this before, but they don't look at drawdown from MCWD pumping. They don't evaluate the cone of depression to see if they would overlap with the slant well pumping cone of depression. We saw the maps of the cones of depression from the slant well system as modeled by Cal-Am. They look pretty extensive. They come pretty close to the MCWD monitor or production wells. And I would be very surprised if there's not some overlap in the cones of depression between those two pumping systems. That's called well interference. And in other words, the two pumping systems are competing for the same water. MCWD has water rates. Cal-Am does not in these basins. So, that I think represents a loss of resource in terms of, or potential loss of resource in terms of the MCWD production.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Trudell. I appreciate your summary. Took a little longer than expected, primarily because I kept interrupting you, but I figured if I had questions, it was best for me to ask them right when I thought of them.
Sure, that makes sense.
So before we'll take a break now, but first of all, I'm just going to ask for rough time estimates. I understand sometimes it's hard to make a good time estimate, but first of all, for any attorney for Marina Coast Water District, are you planning to ask any cross-examination questions of Dr. Trudell?
No, Mr. Lilly, at this time, we don't have a plan to ask Mr. Trudell any questions.
Okay, and Mr. Newdecker, are you going to be asking any cross-ex questions?
No, Mr. Lilly.
Okay, thank you. So, Cal-Am, I assume you will be asking questions. Can one of the Cal-Am attorneys give me a time estimate for your cross-examination of Dr. Trudell?
Sure, this is Michael Betts. We do respectfully request some cross-examination, and whatever you think is reasonable, Mr. Lilly, we'll work with. And two observations there. I hope you know we've really tried to stick with our time estimates, including, I think, all of our experts and Mr. Crooks were given an hour, and we stuck to that by the book. And then two, I'm taking your admonition seriously that some of the technological issues are better addressed by our experts, who are very anxious to respond to some of the questions you have. So with all that, you know, an hour or so, if that's reasonable to you, but we'll have to see where we go.
Okay. I'm going to write that down. That's a good, accurate attorney's estimate, an hour or so. I'm going to maybe use that one in the future. So thank you. And I'm not giving you a hard time. I understand it's hard to know exactly how long it'll take, depending on what answers you get. So let's do this. Let's take a 15-minute break. It's now just before 11 o'clock. So let's come back at 11:15. And we'll do the cross-ex, and we'll see if it really takes an hour till 12:15, we can take a lunch break then. If it's going to take a lot longer, we may take a break before you complete it. I assume, Mr. Betts, you're conducting the cross-ex?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So just as a reminder, if you don't want the rest of us to hear what you're saying internally, turn off your microphone and camera, but don't log off. And then we'll all be back at 11:15. So thank you. Okay. It looks like most of us anyway are back. And it's 11:15. So Mr. Betts, you may proceed with your cross-examination questions of Dr. Trudell.
Thank you, Mr. Lilly. Good morning, Dr. Trudell. Nice to see you again.
Good morning, Mr. Betts. Happy to see you again.
We met last week for your deposition, correct?
We did, yes.
It's my understanding you retired from the practice of hydrology, what, about a year or so ago? Is that correct?
I retired from full-time work at my company and switched to part-time status with zero benefits.
Sir, I believe you told me you retired in July of 2021. Is that correct?
Yes,
And you have not had any United States-based education. Is that correct?
that's right. Yes, my education was entirely within the country of Canada.
Okay, you have no degrees from any institution in the United States, correct?
That's correct. Yep.
And the first few years of your work focused on coal surface mining, reclamation, hydrology for inland property in Canada, correct?
Yes, that was in the province of Alberta.
Okay, Alberta, that's in Canada, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's one of the western provinces.
And you spent the first, what, about 2 decades doing that type of work?
I did that type of work for about the first 8 years of my employment at the Alberta Research Council. It was like a government research lab. And I was a research hydrogeologist. So that was about the first 8 years of that experience. And then I went on to do more environmentally related work in terms of groundwater remediation and technologies and things like that.
I thought you told me your deposition that from 1980 to 1996, you were doing coal surface mining, reclamation, hydrology. Was that correct?
No, I broke it down into 2 stages. The first 8 years were coal surface mining related work, and the second 8 years was environmental technology.
And we don't have any coal mining related issues in this case, correct?
Well, the soil salinization was one of the main issues related to coal surface mining, also post-mining water supply. So, there's some carryover. It's salinization and it's water supply.
I'm sorry, you're trying to say that coal surface mining, inland Canadian work is an issue in this case?
No, but water supply is an issue and salinization is an issue. So, in this particular case, I was talking about salinization of soil from salts that were distributed over the reclaimed landscape, but also present in the natural landscape. So,
I'm sorry, that wasn't my question. My question is coal surface mining reclamation an issue in this case?
no,
You've only been an expert or retained as an expert once before, correct?
that's correct. Yes,
So through your entire history of doing what you do, this is the second time you've ever been retained as an expert.
this is the second time. That's correct.
And that's during your retirement period.
It is, yes.
You've never worked, sir, in the Salinas Valley Basin before, correct?
No, I have not worked in the Salinas Valley groundwater basin. I've worked in many groundwater basins across North America, Southern California, not so much in Northern California, and across Canada, the US, Western US, Southwestern US, and other places in the world as well. So,
Doctor, I apologize. If you can answer my questions, it would be really appreciated. I'm trying to keep this in a nice time frame, okay?
sure.
Objection, argumentative.
There's no question here, so I'm going to overrule the objection, but Dr. Trudell, try to just give short, succinct answers to Mr. Betts's questions, and that will make the process go more efficiently. So please go ahead, Mr. Betts.
To be clear, you've never worked in the Salinas Valley Basin before, correct?
I have not worked in the Salinas Valley groundwater basin
You've
previously.
never worked in the Monterey Basin before, correct?
Was your previous question related to the Salinas Valley groundwater basin?
It was.
Monterey Base sub-basin is a sub-basin of the Salinas Valley groundwater basin, but no, I have not worked there previously.
And did you sit in the testimony from our experts?
Oh, yes, I did.
So you understand, for example, Mr. Durbin's been working in the basin for decades, correct?
Yes, I understand that.
And Mr. Leffler's been working on this project in the basin for over a decade, correct?
I understand that, yes.
You personally have never created a superposition model, correct?
No, I have not.
Never written about it either, correct?
No, I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic, so I generally don't write academic type papers. I write consulting reports. And I've used superposition models, but never created them from scratch. Usually there wouldn't be the model of my choice. Let's put it that way.
Let's go to my question, sir. Is you've never written or published about superposition models, correct?
Okay, so I have written reports about superposition models. I worked on a solar energy project in the Colorado River Basin, used a superposition model and provided a report that was submitted to the California Energy Commission, CEC.
Doctor, are you testifying you've published about superposition models before?
No, you asked me if I ever wrote about it. So yeah, I didn't publish anything. It was just a report that was submitted to the CEC. So, but I did write about it. It wasn't my model. It was a model that I inherited. I made a number of changes to it, did a number of modeling runs, but haven't published anything. But I have written at least that one report using a superposition model.
The question, sir, is have you published anything about superposition?
Okay, Mr. Betts, you can move on. He's answered that question. He said he does not publish a report, but he has written a report.
You've only done one transient model before, created from scratch, correct?
From scratch, yes. As I mentioned, I've used transient models in a large number of investigations as a technical director, but I've only created one from scratch.
That's the question. And the one that you created from scratch, that was in the early 2000s, correct?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And in terms of steady state models, you've done a couple of those, but those were all well over 2 decades ago, correct?
Let me think. I would say yes, most of them are. All of the ones that I created are probably about 2 decades old. Again, in the intervening period, my role has been as a technical director. I have a group of modelers that work under my direction, and they're the ones who are actually creating and running models. And it's not the kind of work that I generally do anymore.
So Mike, please, doctor, I'm stuck with a tight time frame. I need you just to answer my question.
So Mr. Betts, you can move on. I think that was a reasonable explanation in response to your question.
Since retirement, you've given up a number of your memberships, correct?
I have, yeah. I didn't see any particular need to continue them on since I wasn't going to be reimbursed for the fees. So
which ones? For example, it was the National Groundwater Association. Are you still a member of that association?
Not an active member, no.
What about the American Geophysical Union? Are you still a member of that one?
No, I haven't been a member of that for a number of years.
I think you've also withdrawn your membership from the International Association of Hydrologists. Is that true?
That's correct, yeah.
And I think you've also given up a number of your licenses. Can you tell us which licenses you've given up?
Professional geologist and/or hydrogeologist licenses for the state of Washington, state of Oregon, and the province of Alberta, Canada.
Now for this project, sir, you only started in May of 2022. Is that correct?
Approximately, yes.
And for that, you've been paid over $100,000, give or take. Is that fair?
Well, my company has billed that much. Personally, I have not been paid anywhere near that much money.
Okay, fair enough. Your company's billed over $100,000 for your work since May, correct?
Yes.
we have one or two exhibits I'd like to show the witness. The first of which was sent this morning. It's the deposition notice, Exhibit 128, CalAm 128.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if we've moved that into the CalAm exhibit folder yet, but my staff can either get it, if they've moved it, they can get it from there. Otherwise, they can get it from the email. But let's screen share exhibit CalAm 128.
Mr. Lee, I can make this go faster. There is the other exhibit we uploaded this morning, which will be more important, but for this one, I could proceed.
Well, we'll get them.
Sure,
It'll just take us a moment.
no problem.
I told you, my staff is good. So we
By the
now
way-
have exhibit CalAm 128. Well, I think we do. This is exhibit CalAm 128, I believe is posted. This hasn't been accepted into evidence yet, but we will move it into the exhibit folder. And then Mr. Betts, if you want to, you can offer that at a later point, but we have it on the screen now. So go ahead with your question.
Thank you. And naturally, I think everyone here joins in your comment. Your staff has been incredible, particularly Ms. Mullen, of pulling all these together. So a general thank you.
We all do it from different locations, but they do very well. So anyway, go ahead.
Got it. You've seen this notice of your deposition before, is that correct?
I've seen it, yes.
If we could scroll to the pages that has the document request, which starts on page 4 of the document, please.
Okay, let's scroll down to page 4. And this is the beginning of the request for documents. So go ahead with your question.
Doctor, you see the screen on your page, that's document request, correct?
You see it, yes.
Prior to your deposition, you had not seen these document requests, correct?
I didn't read this deposition notice in any detail. Mr. Spalding and I talked about it in some detail, but I didn't review it in any detail in
Got it. So
particular.
Mr. Spalding told you what documents to collect to produce to us, correct?
We discussed it, and I had, I think, a good understanding of what he was asking me to provide, and I provided everything he asked for.
You worked with a couple of your colleagues on this project, correct?
I did, yes. Technical support and a project manager who is also a senior reviewer.
I think there's a third person you mentioned as well.
Well, yes, a GIS graphics person who produced most of the maps and other, excuse me, other map-based products that are in my reports. Excuse me 1 second, please.
No problem. And if it's okay, you can take this down.
Okay, if you're done with that, we'll take that down and get ready for, is the next one, I checked the email this morning, is the next one CalAm 129?
Yeah, that'll come later, Mr. Lill. I've got 1 or 2 follow-ups on this.
Okay, so we'll have it sort of waiting in the wings. Go ahead.
And you emailed your colleagues as you worked through this project since May, correct?
I would say yes. Certainly when I needed support, I would ask if they're available, and I'd give them an idea what the task was, and see if they had time to help me out.
And you didn't produce any of those emails to us, correct?
I don't believe I did, no.
And you didn't produce any draft reports to us, correct?
Well, our company policy is that we don't retain draft reports. We only retain final reports, typically a Word document and a PDF. So I don't believe that I provided any draft reports, just the final reports.
You don't believe so, or you did or didn't?
I don't think I did. I mean, I'm trying to recall what was in my document production file. I don't recall delivering any draft reports, only final reports.
And sir, as it relates to all the work you've done, your direct testimony, your rebuttal, your SIR rebuttal, at the end of the day, you have no opinions in this case. All you have is various thoughts, correct?
Well, let me explain what I mean by that. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not familiar with legal jargon. As you pointed out, this is only the second time I've appeared as an expert witness. So my use of legal terminology is probably not what you would expect an expert to provide. But when I say thoughts, I'm saying original thoughts that actually are my opinions on the matter. I was asked by Shartz's to provide testimony with respect to the questions that the court provided, and then rebuttal testimony, of course, so rebuttal testimony. But I was asked in the context of providing testimony, not necessarily expert opinions. But when I say thoughts, what I mean is opinions.
All right, I'd like to read from Dr. Trudell's deposition, Mr. Lilly. If that could be pulled up, we uploaded it last Friday. And I'd like to start on page 58, line 9, and read through page 60, line 4.
Okay, we should be able to get that from the folder of deposition transcripts. Okay, so we'll scroll to page 58.
Starting at line 9.
Well, so first of all, Dr. Trudell, are you familiar with the transcript of your deposition that was taken last week?
Yes, I've looked at it.
Okay, so go ahead. So, Mr. Betts, I'm not sure what the easiest way to do, but proceed as you know, considering the constraints we have being all in different locations. I don't
Sure.
know if you want to read parts of this and then ask him questions or how you want to proceed, but go ahead.
Yeah, this won't happen, too often. This one's really important, Mr. Lilly, and I think it'll be self-explanatory. So I am going to read a page or two, starting, as I said, on 58, line 9 through 60, line 4. I begin. Question on 58, line 9. And what more did Mr. Spalding tell you in the first communication? Answer. He described the nature of the project and gave me very general idea of what the requirements would be, period. He said it was not a trial, comma, it's not a jury, comma, it was a board hearing and they would require expert testimony. And I thought that was it. Question, you said you thought that was it. Did it become more? Answer, well, yeah. It came from an expert testimony report that became rebuttal report and then surrebuttal report. Question, right. Answer.
Okay, go ahead and scroll down, Ms. Mullen, so we can see the rest of that page.
And then a presentation to go along with the direct testimony. So it turned out to be more than what I was expecting. Question for retirement. Next page.
We'll go to the next page.
Answer, yeah, exactly. Question, so what did he tell you? What kind of work did he want you to do? What did he tell you? Answer, he said he wanted me to review the work that he had done, that had been done, particularly the 2018 FEIR, and, you know, I guess he didn't really ask me to formulate opinions. He just said he wanted to know what my thoughts were. You know, we never really talked about opinions. I don't even think I used the word in my expert testimony document. And so, you know, but from my previous experience, I realized that it was more or less what I'd been asked to do is to review these reports.
Okay, wait, let us scroll down.
Then formulate questions or comments that looked at, you know, perhaps strengths and weaknesses of those reports. Question. So you were to formulate questions or comments about strengths or weaknesses in prior reports. Is that an accurate summary of what you just said? Answer, I think so, yeah. Question, and not to formulate opinions? Your answer, right. Question, and you haven't formulated any opinions, correct? Next page, please. Not specifically called opinions, comma, no. Question, what you formulated is what you characterized as thoughts, correct? Your answer, yes. Do you see that, sir?
Yes.
And when I started your deposition, you swore to tell me the truth, correct?
Yes.
Under penalty of perjury, right?
Yes.
And I told you if there's any question that you didn't understand to stop me, correct?
I think you did mention that.
And I also told you if there's any reason you couldn't give me your best, most God's honest answers to the testimony that day, that you let me know, correct?
I believe you said that, yes.
And that was your testimony in the deposition, correct?
Right.
Okay, you can take that down for now. Thank you.
Okay.
But as I did explain.
Wait,
There's no question, sir.
Wait, first of all, logistics here. Mr. Betts, I'll ask you to work with your staff to label this. I think we're up to Cal-Am 130. So following our prior practice, please make a copy of the cover page and pages 58 through 60, and we'll have those be an exhibit and you can offer them. Of course, City of Marina can object.
Yes, sir, we'll do. And there may be others, but I will follow the same practice.
Yeah, so Dr. Trudell, you may want to have some follow-up, but the way we do this is Mr. Betts does get to ask the questions. If Mr. Spalding thinks he wants you to ask some he wants to ask you clarifying questions after Mr. Betts is done with his cross-examination, he will have the right to do that. So I am cutting you off, but that's just because that's the process we follow in this process. So we'll go ahead with Mr. Betts's questions, but if Mr. Spalding thinks some clarification is necessary, he can ask you at the end.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification, Mr. Lilly.
Yeah, you're welcome. Go ahead, Mr. Betts.
Sure. And after all of your direct testimony, rebuttal, your meeting with attorneys, it's true, you have no opinions or thoughts on seawater intrusion, correct?
Objection, misstates his testimony, vague, ambiguous.
Well, it does, Mr. Betts, he did say he had thoughts. So that does misstate his testimony from his deposition. He said he had thoughts.
Sure, I'll clarify.
If you want to pursue this, you can break it up into opinions versus thoughts, although I have to say, I'm not sure, particularly from someone who's not a lawyer, that there's a big distinction between the two, but I'll allow you to pursue that line of questioning if you want to, but please make it so it's not a compound question.
Sure. You have no thoughts on seawater intrusion, correct?
I was not asked to respond to the court's question about seawater intrusion. So I do have in my either rebuttal and or rebuttal report, I do look at the aspect of potential seawater migration inland or seawater intrusion, if you would call it that, due to drawdown outside of the zonal capture of the project pumping system, slant well system. But I didn't formulate anything specifically related to addressing the court's question about seawater intrusion.
All right, I'm sorry, Mr. Litt, I need to go back to the deposition. This time, page 134, starting at line 19.
Okay, my crack staff will get to page, this is Dr. Trudell's, the transcript of Dr. Trudell's deposition, and we'll go to page 134. Go ahead and tell us what line you'd like us to scroll to.
You bet. Line 134 on
page 134.
I'm sorry, page 134, line 19. And to be
Okay,
clear,
so we'll scroll down to line 19. Just give us a moment and go ahead.
I'll be reading through page 135, line 12, but I will begin on
Okay,
134.
just go slowly so we can follow, but go ahead. You're reading very clearly, so please keep it up.
Thank you. Starting on 134, line 19, my question. Fair enough, period. So you have no thoughts on the seawater intrusion issue in this case. Is that fair? Answer. I haven't expressed an opinion. No. Question. And you won't do so, like at trial. I don't want to get surprised at trial. Next page.
And I'll read the Mr. Spalding's objection. You don't have to read it. I'm reading it to myself. Go ahead.
My question again, you can answer, doctor. Answer. I don't expect to render an opinion on the seawater intrusion question, period. It's not in my direct testimony, you may have noticed. Question, or the rebuttal, or the surrebuttal. Answer, right. Question, so you don't intend to do any thoughts or opinions on seawater intrusion. Fair enough? Answer, I think that's obvious. You see that, sir?
Yes.
And that was, again, your sworn testimony under penalty of perjury less than a week ago, right?
Yeah, and it's exactly consistent with what I just explained.
Well,
There's nothing that I call an opinion on seawater intrusion. I did comment on the potential effect of drawdown outside the capture zone of the slant well system, I think in my rebuttal report, and maybe I didn't make that clear, but it's not expressed as an opinion on seawater intrusion. And I say in my testimony right here, so I didn't express any opinions on seawater intrusion.
Sir, why didn't you tell me that in your deposition? I had one chance to depose you when you swore that you were going to tell me the truth. And you told me you had neither thoughts or opinions. Why did you do that?
Objection, argumentative.
Yes.
I'm going to overrule the objection. I think it's a fair question, so I'm going to allow that question. I will say, Mr. Betts, by the time you took Dr. Trudell's deposition, you did have his written rebuttal testimony. So I don't think you were totally blindsided by this, but go ahead, Mr. Wait, so so I'm overruling the objection. Why don't you just repeat the question, Mr. Betts, and he can answer it, and then we can go forward as appropriate.
When I got to take your deposition, I was very confused about many of your statements and rebuttal, rebuttal, what it is. So I wanted to make sure I knew, under penalty of perjury, whether you were going to give thoughts or opinions on seawater intrusion. And you told me when you swore to tell the truth, you had none. Why is it today that you're saying that you do have such thoughts? What?
No,
Objection misstates his testimony, argumentative.
Okay, I'm going to overrule the objection. Just go ahead and answer. I mean, this is a pretty collateral matter, so I'd like to move on. But go ahead and explain, Dr. Trudell, your response to Mr. Betts's question.
And this can be taken down. I'm sorry.
As I said, there was no real discussion of seawater intrusion in my direct testimony. And I don't recall now if it was a rebuttal report, but I think it was my rebuttal report where I talked about drawdown from the slant wells pumping system outside of the capture zone of the slant well pumping system. So, you know, where there's a difference in hydraulic head, there can be flow, obviously, in the direction of the gradient. And there's potential because of the drawdown for flow to go from the ocean toward the inland. But I'm also arguing at the same time that particularly in the dune sand aquifer, the direction of groundwater flow is seaward. So, you know, I'm not saying that there is or isn't seawater intrusion. I would conclude that my answer to that really is I don't know if there's going to be net seawater intrusion because of this project or not.
You don't know. Is that what you just said? You don't know?
Right, and that's why I don't express an opinion on the topic.
None of your work has been peer reviewed for this matter, correct?
I've had a senior reviewer internally, but not peer reviewed externally, no.
Sir, my question was not, did somebody internally do it? It was peer reviewed. Please answer my questions.
Oh,
Well, I
wait,
consider my senior
Mr. Betts, please. That distinction is clear to you. It was not clear to him. He's trying to answer your question. So that is unnecessarily argumentative. So please move on.
Are you familiar with the concept of being peer reviewed, doctor?
In the academic literature, yes. In terms of consulting practice, I would say it's uncommon. We almost always do. In fact, we always do senior review. So a more senior or a senior colleague or person of technical nature typically reviews every single report that we submit.
Outside of your group, has anyone peer reviewed any of your work?
Objection vague as to project or.
Oh, wait, yeah. So Mr. Betts, why don't you restate the question as to any of his work regarding this project? I assumed that was what you meant, but if you could restate it.
That is what I meant. Outside of your entity, has anyone peer reviewed your work related to this matter?
Related to this project, you mean?
Correct.
I'm thinking. I think all of the peer review work that was done or senior review work that was done was members within the Advisian division of Worley group.
Members? So, I'm sorry, okay, I'd like to read from your deposition again. Page 43.
Okay, we'll get up page 43. And we scroll down. What line do you want?
Page 43, line 8 through line 13.
Okay, so why don't you just read it out loud, Mr. Betts?
I will. Question I asked at your deposition: has any of your work been peer reviewed in this matter? Answer: only by Stephanie. Question, outside your entity, has any of your work been peer reviewed? Answer, no. Do you recall that testimony, sir?
Yes, and that's the same answer I just gave you.
So, and just so I know, Dr. Trudell, does Stephanie work within your company?
Yes, she is. Yeah, she's the project manager and senior reviewer for this project.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Betts.
You could take this down, thank you. You haven't created your own model for the project, correct?
No, I have not.
Would it be fair to say what you were hired to do is you were retained just to criticize and provide thoughts on the models by CalAm and the HWG group?
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair statement. I think that's one way of putting it. I mean, I might provide some clarification on what that means, but you know, I believe that's what I said in my deposition.
So you were paid about $100,000, or your company was, to criticize CalAm and the HWG group, and not to create your own model, correct?
Objection, argumentative.
No, overruled.
No, I mean, we were not, it was not within our scope as requested by Shartz's to develop a groundwater model, only to review the work of others.
But you were specifically retained to criticize the work of others, correct? Being CalAm's and HWG group's work.
Well, criticize is one way to put it. Review is probably more accurate. Not every review leads to criticism. Some reviews lead to identifying things that are you know, good, and other things that do need that are identified as deficiencies. So I think review is a broader and probably more accurate term. But certainly there's significant criticism, and particularly the CalAm modeling work.
Let's talk about that. So in terms of models, would it be fair to say from a 40,000 foot, they're done to help someone understand an issue?
Certainly, because you know, we're typically modeling a hydrogeologic system that's complex. It's got multiple layers. It's got sources of recharge, various sources of inflows and outflows, hydraulic conductivity that varies spatially, history of groundwater recharge and hydraulic heads that vary over time. We've looked at several hydrographs today. You can see how hydraulic head varies over time in this basin. So those are the kinds of things that you can represent in the numerical groundwater flow model that are very difficult to represent by any other means.
I'm sorry, my simple question was, models are generally done to help someone understand an issue. Is that fair?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. And they're not always perfect. You agree?
Yes, I agree with that.
Models can always be better. Fair enough?
But they're typically subject to continuous improvement. There's always new data coming in and other items of you know, revised understanding of the system that you're modeling. We call it the hydrogeological conceptual model. Various things like that that would cause you to revise a model and improve it. So I think there's a tendency for people who do modeling projects to be, you know, continuously improving the model, and we see that in this project too.
Agreed. In terms of standards of reliability for models, are they judged generally by rules of thumb? Is that fair enough?
They are, but the rules of thumb generally are applied to calibration statistics. So there's a suite of calibration statistics that are typically used in evaluating model. It's not really referred to as reliability. It's really the quality of the calibration that's being evaluated with the calibration statistics. But calibration statistics alone don't really tell you that much about the overall quality or reliability of the model. It just tells you that the model, as it was analyzed with the calibration tools, that the model meets these statistical parameters, which you could describe as rules of thumb, because you know, they request or they suggest that, you know, certain statistical parameters should be less than 10% or less than 5% or within a range. So, you know, those can be, they're not really hard and fast rules. That's why I call them rules of thumb.
Fair enough. Using that definition, you agree with me that the 2022 North Marina model meets those rules of thumb, right?
The overall calibration statistics generally meet those rules of thumb. So I would agree with that statement to that extent, but the calibration, as I mentioned in my presentation, is not very well documented, particularly on a layer by layer basis. So when you throw everything into one big bucket, it's much easier to get good calibration statistics than if you break it out into individual layers or individual portions of the model or individual areas. So, that's not provided in the CalNum 89 report.
But in whole, the 2022 North Marina model met those rules of thumb, correct?
The overall model, I would say, does. Excuse me, just 1 second. Coffee.
No problem.
Okay, please go ahead.
In terms of that model, let's talk about the 2022 North Marina model. You agree it got a couple things correct, right?
I think there were certainly improvements made in the 22 model versus the 2016 model.
For example, it included recharge. That's something it got correct, right?
It did include recharge, so I think that was an improvement. It wasn't very well documented, as I explained in my presentation, but it was better than the previous model, which had no recharge.
And it's a fully transient model that made it better, correct?
Yes, and they increased the calibration period, and it's a fully transient model, which I think is an improvement. Again, probably not as well documented as I think it should be, but it's an improvement.
And well, in terms of that's something that you would characterize as getting correct, right?
Again, I would call them improvements. Without considering the lack of documentation in some of those improvements, particularly the recharge. How did they bring the recharge in from the regional model into the local model? I couldn't say if they got it right or not because I don't know how they did it. It's certainly better than no recharge, but I don't know if they brought it in correctly.
And something else they got correct was there was a western extension of the Fort Ord Salinas Valley Aquitard, correct?
Well, and again, we talked about that, or I've talked about that in my presentation, and I think the extension of the Aquitard was probably an improvement. But then for some reason, the Aquitard properties were transmitted above and below into the dune sand aquifer layers, which I have significant criticism of.
Yeah, I'd like to read again from your deposition, I guess. We'll start with page 18.
Okay, we'll put up page 18. Go ahead. What line do you want us to go to?
If we could please start at line 6 and we will go through line 23, please.
Okay, we'll scroll as you read. Go ahead.
Thank you. My question was, did that model get anything correct? Answer, it introduced recharge, period. It's a fully transient model, period. So those were characteristics that were improvements over the previous model, which was a steady state model. There was a superposition version, period. There was a transient of the 2016 model, but they didn't actually move forward with it. So they did most of the FF 2018 FEIR work was done based on the superposition model, period. Question, and again, what else did it get right? I think you said it introduced recharge. What else did it get right? And if we could respectfully move to line 20.
Yeah, we'll scroll down to line 23. Go ahead.
Starting in line 19, answer, there was a western extension of the Fort Ord Salinas Valley Aquitard, which I thought was perhaps a desirable feature, except that the implementation of it in terms of hydraulic conductivity distribution was not acceptable.
Is there a question?
I was
No, there's
just
not.
going to ask that. So Mr. Betts, what's your question?
I'm reading it for impeachment purposes.
Okay, so do you want to just simply ask, did you testify to that during your deposition?
Thank you. That's a good way to do it. That was your sworn penalty of perjury testimony in your deposition, right, doctor?
Yes, that's completely consistent with what I just said.
Wait. That one, Dr. Trudell, you can answer yes or no. So please do.
Oh, so could you repeat the question?
Was that your
question is wait, I'll do it. I'll help you, Mr. Betts.
Sure, thanks.
So, Dr. Trudell, were these in fact your answers to Mr. Betts's questions during your deposition?
Yes.
Okay, and again, if Mr. Spalding wants you to provide some explanation, I'm not sure it's necessary, but we'll leave that to Mr. Spalding to decide if he wants to do on redirect. So with that, Mr. Betts, you may proceed.
Thank you. And you can take this down.
Okay, I hope you or your staff is keeping track of the pages you're reading from. I'm sure you are.
I did
We'll
not.
just- Well, I'll ask you to just copy them all into one exhibit, so we don't have to have 5 different exhibits for his excerpts from his depot transcript.
I will do so. I didn't think there'd be that many, but I certainly will do so.
Yeah, it's not that many pages, but that's
Oh.
our procedure, so that will work well. Go ahead.
You would also agree with me that the 2022 model we're talking about didn't get anything wrong. It just could have been better. Correct?
I would say that's it's a reasonable statement.
Okay.
But again, without adequate documentation, there's always questions about what it got right and what it got wrong. But in general, it was an improvement.
Well, okay, we'll break it down. You agree with me that model did not get anything wrong, correct?
I would generally agree with that, although I would say that things that are not documented, it's very difficult to make a judgment as to whether it's done right or done wrong.
But you testified in your deposition that there was nothing that it got wrong, correct?
I may have testified to that, yes.
It just could have been better.
Again, the documentation question keeps coming up. So, of the things that are documented in CalAm 89, I didn't see any glaring errors or things that you would say where it got it wrong. But I did notice a number of areas where the documentation was incomplete. And so obviously you can't judge the quality of work if there's no documentation of it.
I'm going to read from your deposition again, page 20.
Okay, we'll put up page 20.
Thank you very much. Starting on line 7, going through line 17, please. And may I proceed, Mr. Lilly?
Go ahead, just read, and then probably easiest to then just ask him if he in fact testified to that during his deposition. So go ahead.
Understood. Thank you. Starting on line 7. Anything else the revised model got wrong? Right? Question mark. Answer, not that I can think of. Question. Everything else it got wrong, and I'll represent, I believe the question was anything else, but it reads, everything else it got wrong? Question. Answer. Could have been better, I would say, not necessarily wrong. Question. Could have been better? Answer. Yes. Question. So there's a few things that got right and the rest could have been better. Is that fair? Answer. I would say so. Is that what you testified to in your deposition, sir?
Yes, it is.
You could take that down.
Okay, let's go ahead.
And when I-
Mr. Lilly,
Yes,
that's
Mr. Spalding.
yes, thank you. That's the second time Mr. Betts has read through a deposition for impeachment purposes, but he hasn't actually impeached him. He's basically said, will you read that, please? And is that your testimony? Please take it down. So where is the impeachment?
I disagree, Mr. Spalding. I think Mr. Betts is showing that there, we can argue about how much their inconsistencies are, but he's basically demonstrating either that there are inconsistencies between Dr. Trudell's testimony today and his deposition, or at least I'll say differences in nuances. So I think that's appropriate impeachment, as Mr. Betts has done. And frankly, I don't really want to spend a lot of time arguing about those nuances any further than what he's done. So so to the extent there was an objection in there, I overrule it. And as I say, I think the most efficient way to address your concerns, if you still have any, is you can ask him to clarify on redirect examination.
Thank
So
you.
let's do it that way.
And to sum up the discussion on models, we started with this. You agreed that models could always be better, correct?
Yes.
Now, you're not accusing Mr. Leffler of fabricating any evidence or testimony, correct?
Correct.
You're not accusing Mr. Tim Durbin of fabricating any testimony, correct?
Correct.
Same thing with Dr. Ye. I want to be really clear. You're not accusing him of fabricating or falsifying any testimony or evidence, correct?
Correct.
I now would respectfully ask that we go to Marina 2, your direct testimony, page 11, paragraph 23. Mr. Lilly, I think that's how you asked us to do this way back when, is to go page
Yeah.
and line, and I will do so.
Okay, I think you're doing it right, but we'll, we'll find out when we get
We
there. So
will.
let's go ahead and post exhibit Marina 2. And I'm sorry, you said page 11?
If we could please do, I meant page, if I said so, page 13, paragraph 23.
Well, you may have said 13. Anyway. Okay, so page 13, paragraph 23, which starts on line 3. So we have posted that. Go ahead with your question.
Sure. You wrote this paragraph, correct, Doctor?
Yes, I did.
And here you identify what you call deficiencies identified by Jacobson, James, and Weiss concerning the prior 2018 model, correct?
Yes,
And just so everyone can see it, there's 3 of them that you identified, correct?
I can only see 2 right now.
Oh, no problem. I'm sure.
Oh, we can scroll down. There are 3 bullet points. There we go. We can't
There we go.
quite fit them all on at the same time, but we'll scroll down more if necessary. And if you want to take a minute to read them, that's fine. And let us know if you want us to scroll down.
And let me know, Doctor, when I can proceed.
Okay, please proceed.
So after you read all of James Jacobson's report and all of the Weiss report, you identified what you thought they came up with 3 deficiencies, right?
Wait, and I'm going to say, Mr. Betts, you are misstating his testimony here because it says main deficiencies. So
I certainly meant to say main. So those were the main deficiencies you found, correct?
Yes,
And then there was a revised model that was done after that, correct?
are you referring to the 2022?
That's
North
correct,
American
yes.
model?
Yes.
So yeah, that report was issued in July of this year.
And you agree with me that the first and third main deficiency you identified were taken care of or addressed in the new model, the 2022 model, correct?
The recharge was, well, again, they included recharge, which was an improvement. They have better representation of the groundwater gradients, but we discussed other problems with the representation that would perhaps negate any improvement that they might have produced.
He was just asking you about the first and third bullet points.
Oh, first and third, I'm sorry. Yes, and so it's no longer a superposition model, it's a fully transient model, so that is an improvement too.
So again, my question, the first and third main deficiency you identified were addressed in the 2022 model, correct?
There were improvements made. So obviously I still have identified deficiencies and other issues, but yes, those 2 things were addressed in the 22 model.
And as for the second one, you just don't know one way or another whether it was addressed, correct?
Not really. I mean, I just pointed out in my presentation today that it doesn't seem like they got the gradients right in the dune sand aquifer, or the hydraulic heads rather. So, I think there were improvements made, but also still outstanding issues.
All right, let's go to the deposition again. This is page 180. If this can be taken down for now. And if I can please go to the deposition where you testified under penalty of perjury.
Okay, let's get the page number, please.
185.
Okay.
I'm sorry, no, let's go. I'm sorry. We'll go to 188, please.
Okay, deposition page 188. And what line do you want us to go to?
We could start at line 8, please, and we're going to go through line 15.
Okay, we'll scroll down and go ahead. As I say, it seems to be most efficient, Mr. Betts, for your follow the approach you've been taking of reading it, asking him if he remembers if that in fact was his testimony. And then if you have any follow-up questions, you may go ahead with those.
I agree. Thank you. And reading for the same purposes. So line 8. So the main deficiencies you found, comma, or that you thought existed as identified by James and Weiss, comma, the first and third were addressed in the new model, comma, correct? Question mark. Answer to some extent, yeah. Question. And the second one, you just don't know one way or another. Answer, that's right. Do you see that, sir?
Yes.
And that was your testimony again under penalty of perjury, what, less than a week ago?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And you were telling me the truth in your deposition, right?
Absolutely, yes.
penalty of perjury, right?
Okay, Mr. Betts, we get it that his testimony was all under penalty of perjury. You don't, there's no jury here. You don't need to elaborate. I certainly understand what penalty of perjury means. So just go ahead.
Thank you. You can take this down. Thank you. You agree that the MPWSP, the project, will not affect the 900-foot aquifer, right?
I think my testimony on that matter is that the effects will be minimal.
Okay, let's do the deposition again. Page 172, please.
Okay, we'll go to page 172 and tell us, we've got it here ready, so we can move fairly quickly now.
Yeah, that's
What
been very
line
efficient.
number?
I appreciate it. So 172. Starting at line 7, and we'll go to line 14, please.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. The question, if you can answer my question, again, it would be very helpful. You agree that none of the MCWD supply wells that are mainly completed in the 900-foot aquifer will be affected by the MPWSP, correct? Answer, yes. Question, meaning I'm correct? Answer, yes. That's all I have there. Sir,
Okay, so
again,
ask the question, I'll ask the question. Dr. Trudell, did you in fact give these answers to Mr. Betts's questions during your deposition?
Yes, I did.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Betts.
all right, you can take this down. Thank you very much. Have you heard of the prior project called the RPD that the Marina Coast Water District was to be a part of?
I object. There's no prior project called the RPD. I object to the form of the question is lacking foundation.
You know what? If it helps, it's RDP. I got my 2 letters wrong.
Okay, let's ask Dr. Trudell, are you familiar with the prior proposed project, never constructed, called RDP?
Could you explain what RDP means?
All right, Dr. or Mr. Betts, you go ahead.
I'll go to his deposition.
I think it was regional desalinization project. Is that, let's just, maybe we can move this on a little bit. Is
Well,
that,
I can, in his deposition, you knew exactly what it was, if that's helpful for you, but I can move on, but today. Yeah.
whether
we
he
can go-
knew then and doesn't know now what those letters meant, I don't think is going to be super critical here. So just go on if you have any questions about
Sure.
the RDP, go ahead with those.
Sure. Does that help the explanation of the regional desalinization project, the one we talked about in your?
Yes,
deposition?
that's helpful. And yes, I have heard of it.
Okay. Were you asked to study that in any way?
I wasn't asked that, no.
Were you asked what effects the RDP may have on the Marina Coast wells?
No,
Do you know why you weren't asked to analyze that?
I don't know.
Do you understand if there's any difference between the RDP and the currently proposed project?
I don't know.
Do you understand that one used slant wells, one used vertical wells?
That's my understanding, yes.
And in your opinion, they're both on equal caliber in terms of environmental friendliness, is that correct?
I would say so, yes.
What about the Marina Coast Water District desalinization plant that's located, I don't know, within a mile of the proposed current project? Are you aware of that?
No, I'm not.
Does anyone ask you to analyze that?
No,
Do you know why?
no, I don't know why.
Did you know about it prior to my telling you about it?
No. I wasn't aware of it, no. Not familiar with that project.
What about in general, you're aware of the Coastal Commission recently conditionally approved a project proposed by Callahan, correct?
Yes, I'm generally aware of that decision, yes.
And you understand that's a smaller project than what you analyzed, correct?
I've heard that. I haven't seen any documentation of just what the size of that project is or what the effects of that project is. I haven't seen any CalNEM evaluation of that smaller project.
And therefore you haven't analyzed the smaller project, correct?
No, I have not.
So all of your work concerns, sorry, strike that. So all of the work that you've done does not concern the new project, correct?
All the work that I've done. Sorry, go ahead.
Objection, assumes facts not in evidence that there is a new project.
Proposed.
Well, okay, that's sort of not really a very fair question, Mr. Betts, because a smaller project may have similar types of impacts just on a lower caliber rather. So I think, I mean, clearly has spent some time analyzing the project that's described in his testimony. So I think if you want to ask him about whether or not there'd be any changes in the estimated environmental effects from a smaller project, that's fair. But I think the way you said it was misleadingly argumentative. So why don't you restate your question?
But if you haven't analyzed the proposed smaller project, is that fair?
Well, again, my role is to review reports and primarily reports that have been provided by CalAm and other agencies. But I haven't seen any report from CalAm analyzing that project for me to review it.
Oh, I'm sorry, my question was different. Have you done any independent work on the smaller proposed project?
No, my role is not to do independent work, it's to review the work of others.
Do you know if strike that? There was a concept that you've referenced in your testimony, the sub-basin interface zone. You're familiar with that phrase?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and that was something that was solely used in one of the parties' cross complaints in this action, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
You never heard it before in the prior decades that you've been working in hydrology, correct?
That's right. I understand it to be a local terminology use. It's not a standard hydrogeology term.
So I'm sorry, my question is, you'd never heard it before you saw it in the cross complaint, correct?
That's right. Well, no, actually, sorry, let me restate that. I saw it in the questions answered by the court or asked by the court. And then I also studied it in the cross complaint.
Right. And those are the only two places you've ever seen it used before, correct?
Yes.
Mercifully, I'm not going to show you the prior State Water Board staff report, the prior PUC decisions we discussed in your deposition, and or go through the Coastal Commission staff's findings. But my question to you is, according to you, the State Water Board, the PUC, the California legislature, and the Coastal Commission just all got it wrong, correct?
Objection, lacks foundation, vague and ambiguous, and should. Objection.
Could I take those one by one instead of rolling them all together in a compound question?
Mr. Betts, the line of questioning is appropriate. The objection is appropriate and is sustained. I think, I mean, I know you're trying to go quickly because I've asked you to go quickly. And I think though here, if you want to ask him about the prior State Water Board staff memo or the prior CPUC decision or the prior Coastal Commission decision, you should go one at a time, as Mr. Spalding suggested. But most importantly, you should ask him what he knows about those prior documents, what was his level of review. And then if you want to ask him whether he thinks they got it right or got it wrong, that's fine. But we do need some kind of a foundation because those are all very long documents. And I don't know whether or not Dr. Trudell, I don't know whether he reviewed them at all, or if he did, in what level of detail. So I do think you need to break it up and establish a foundation. And again, I'm not criticizing you. I know you're trying to go quickly here, but please do it that way so we don't have any confusion.
Can I try one alternative way? Is there's a question and answer from his deposition that I just would ask a follow-up to.
Okay, why don't you do that? And let's just read. You're obviously very well prepared, which I admire, on having the deposition transcript pages. So let's get that up, look at it, and you can decide whether or not you have any follow-up questions. And then, of course, as I said before, Mr. Spalding can decide whether or not he has any follow-up questions. So that may be far more efficient. So let's do it that way.
Perfect, thank you. So it's page 168, lines 4 through 9.
Okay, so we'll get up page 168 of Dr. Trudell's transcript of his deposition, and we'll go to page 168, lines 4 through 9. Go ahead.
So the question reads, so the PUC got it wrong, comma, the State Water Board got it wrong, comma, the California legislator got it wrong, the Coastal Commission got it wrong, and the Coastal Commission misinterpreted its own hydrologist's work. Is that your testimony? Your answer is yes. My question to you today is, what is the it that you are agreeing got wrong in this question? What is the it?
I think you mean their interpretation or findings of the validity of the project or the value of the project.
Okay. You could take this down. Thank you. So, Mr. Lilly, I've gone for about an hour. I did give an hour-ish. I've spent far more time reading than I thought that I would. I am probably got another 45 minutes left at this rate, assuming I may need to be reading questions.
Okay, and thank you for letting me know. And I think we now have figured out a way for you to efficiently work with deposition transcripts, and you certainly have a right to do that. So let's go ahead and take a noon break. I think it's about time. It's 12:15. So let's take a break until 1:30. And then you may continue with your questioning. I'll sort of, and you are being efficient, and if it's 45 minutes more, that will be fine. I'm not going to try to cut you off short of that. Hopefully it won't be a whole lot more than that. And then Mr. Spalding, it sounds like you may have, I have some questions, although I should hold myself to a time estimate too, but I'm not going to, probably 30 minutes. And then Mr. Spalding, you'll have questions. So let's go ahead that way. Let's come back at 1:30. That may give you, Mr. Betts, a chance to refine your questions a little bit based on what you've heard. And Mr. Spalding may give you an opportunity to develop your redirect questions based on what you heard today. So we'll do that and we'll proceed. So again, as a reminder, between the morning session and the afternoon session, everyone does need to log off and then log back on, because we have a separate recording for the afternoon session. So with that, I will see everybody at 1:30. Have a nice lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.